The temperature gauge on Ranger Elena shows truck red 19 degrees when it should have red 41. She checked it twice, tapped the dashboard once out of habit more than logic, and pulled into the empty gravel lot at the Slough Creek trailhead at 6:52 p.m. Behind her, the sky over the Absarica Range was bleeding orange in a black. In front of her, a single abandoned Toyota Tacoma sat with its driver door open, dome lights still glowing weakly, keys still in ignition. The truck belonged to Daniel Ferris, 29, a wildlife photographer who'd told his girlfriend he'd be back by sunset. That had been 2 days ago. Elena had worked Yellowstone's northern range for 6 years. She'd pulled people out of thermal features, talked hikers down from panic after wolf sightings, and once carried an unconscious tourist 4 miles on her own back after a bison charge. She did not spook easily, but something about this trailhead, the silence of it, the way even the wind seemed to be holding its breath made the hair on her arms stand up before she'd even stepped out of the truck. She radioed it in. "Dispatch, this is Joe. I'm at the Slough Creek trailhead. Subject vehicle located, driver door open, engine cold. Beginning search on foot." Static answered her. Then nothing. She tried again. Nothing but low hiss that, if she let her imagination run, which she refused to do, sounded almost like breathing. Elena had joined the Park Service the year after her divorce, when she needed somewhere quiet enough to stop replaying every conversation that had gone wrong in her head. Yellowstone had given her that. 9,600 square miles of lodgepole pine and geyser basin, more silence than any one person could fill with regret, even a person as good at regret as she was. She'd learned the northern range the way some people learn scripture by heart, by repetition, until she could have walked Slough Creek trail blind. Tonight, walking it with her eyes wide open, she felt like she'd never been here before at all. The permit records showed Daniel Ferris had checked in for a 3-night backcountry stay at campsite 4M1, a spot popular with photographers chasing the autumn elk rut. His girlfriend, Priya Anand, had called the ranger station at 4:47 that afternoon, her voice tight with the particular fear of someone who already suspects the answer and is calling anyway, hoping to be told she's wrong. He always checks in. Every single trip, even when there's no signal, he finds a ridge and sends one text. He didn't send anything yesterday. He didn't send anything today. Elena had told her they'd look. She hadn't told her how quickly look could become something else entirely. She checked her watch. 7:14 p.m. sunset in Yellowstone this time of year came fast and left faster. The long alpine twilight collapsing in a full dark within 20 minutes once the sun dropped behind the Absaricas. She had, at best, an hour of usable light. She radioed dispatch one more time to confirm her planned full search at first light with the team, but a quick recon pushed tonight while the trail was still fresh and got only that same low static hiss in reply. Something about the hiss made her stomach tighten. It didn't sound like interference. It sounded like something breathing into the microphone on the other end. She clipped the radio back to her belt and kept walking. Elena found the first sign 40 minutes in, a Nikon camera strap, snapped clean, hanging from a lodgepole pine 8 feet off the ground. Too high for a fall, too clean a cut for a branch to have done it. She kept walking. The temperature kept dropping. By the time her thermometer read 4 degrees, she noticed the elk. There were carcasses scattered along the creek bed, 6 of them, maybe 7, all stripped down to bone with a precision no wolf pack left behind. No drag marks. No scut, no claws scoring on the bones at all. In fact, just clean, almost surgical removal of every scrap of meat, as if something had eaten with hands instead of teeth. Her radio crackled to life just long enough for one word to come through, garbled, in a voice she didn't recognize. Hungry. Elena's hand moved to the bear spray on her belt. She knelt beside the nearest carcass, professional instinct overriding fear for just long enough to document, Its 6 years of wildlife reports had taught her exactly what a wolf kill looked like, what a grizzly kill looked like, what scavenging looked like after the fact. This matched none of it. The bones weren't scattered. They were stacked, almost neatly, ribs set beside ribs, femurs laid parallel to femurs, as if something had taken the time to sort what it had finished with. She counted 7 skulls before she made herself stop counting. The forest around her had gone unnaturally quiet. No owls, no wind through the pines. Even the creek beside her, which should have been running loud with autumn snowmelt, seemed to have dropped to a whisper, as though the water itself didn't want to draw attention. Elena stood, brushed the frost off her knees, and checked her thermometer again. 2 degrees. In September, at an elevation where the average nighttime low rarely dropped below 30. She thought, not for the first time that night, about turning back. She thought about Priya Anand's voice on the phone, cracking on the word please. She kept walking. If you've made it this far into these woods with me, go ahead and hit subscribe now, because trust me, you do not want to miss what's waiting for Elena deeper in. And drop a comment telling me, would you have turned back at the elk carcasses, or kept going? I want to know before we go deeper. She found Daniel Ferris's tent 40 minutes later, pitched with military precision in a small hollow beside the creek. Zipped shut, untouched, inside. His sleeping bag, his boots, his wallet, his satellite phone with 94 battery and 0 signal. And his journal. Elena sat on her heels outside the tent flap and read it by headlamp, 1 page at a time, telling herself she was building a timeline, that this was standard procedure, that reading a missing man's private thoughts was just part of the job. She almost believed it until she reached the second day's entries. Day 1 good light this evening. Got a shot of a bull elk bugling against the ridge that might be the best frame of my career. Priya's going to love it. Camped at 4M1, quiet night. Saw a distant grizzly, but it moved off north. Day 2 saw something on the ridge at dusk. Too tall to be a bear, standing up. Too thin. Didn't move for almost 10 minutes, just watched me. I told myself it was a burned tree. Told myself that for almost an hour before I admitted burned trees don't turn their heads. Day 2. Later it's not a tree. I found tracks near the creek. Almost human, but the stride is wrong, too long between steps, like it's not walking so much as covering ground the way a wolf covers ground. I haven't eaten since yesterday morning, but I'm not hungry. That's the strange part. I should be starving by now. I feel nothing at all. No hunger, no fear, really just this strange calm like something is telling me it's all going to be fine. Day 3, morning didn't sleep. Heard something circling the tent most of the night, slow, patient, never coming close enough to touch the fabric. My hands are steady writing this. That scares me more than anything else. I should be shaking. Day 3, evening I hear it breathing outside the tent right now. I know that sounds insane. It's a low sound, what almost like breath drag through something that used to be lungs. I keep thinking about the elders back home, the stories about the thing that comes when men get too hungry, too desperate, too far from other people. I always thought those were just stories to keep kids close to camp. I'm going to step outside and look. I have to know. If someone finds this, and I'm not around to explain, don't go looking for me at night. There was no day 4. Elena closed the journal and pressed it flat against her chest for a moment, as if she could hold in whatever had happened to the man who'd written those words. Her breath fogged in front of her, thick as smoke. Elena closed the journal, and that's when she heard it. A long, slow exhale from somewhere in the tree line, low and hollow, like wind dragged through a cave that shouldn't exist in an open forest. She turned off her headlamp. In the sudden dark, her eyes adjusted enough to see it a shape between 2 pines, 30 yards off, tall enough that its head brushed the lowest branches. Too thin for any animal that size to survive. It didn't move. It simply stood there, watching her the way a predator watches something it hasn't decided is worth the effort yet. Elena had grown up hearing her grandmother's stories, Cree stories, told carefully, half in warning about a spirit that lived in the hungriest parts of winter. A thing that had once been a man, or many men, who had crossed a line no one was meant to cross, and who could never, ever be full again. With Tycho, her grandmother never said the word lightly. She never said it after dark. The shape took one step forward. The temperature dropped another 2 degrees in that single motion, as if the cold radiated off it like heat off a stove. Elena did not run. Running, her training told an animal exactly which direction prey moved. Instead, she backed away slowly, keeping the creek at her side, keeping her light off, keeping her breathing even as her heart slammed against her ribs. The thing did not follow Nod directly. It simply seemed to arrive closer each time she blinked, the way a shadow shifts when you're not looking directly at it. 20 yards. 15. Close enough now that she could see it wasn't fully solid at the edges, its outline fraying into the dark like smoke pulled thin. Then it spoke. Not with a mouth, she could see the sound came from everywhere and nowhere, low and grating, like ice cracking underweight. So hungry, Ranger. So long. Elena's flashlight was in her hand before she decided to use it. She hit the switch, and the beam cut straight into the thing's face, and for one full second, she saw it clearly. Skin pulled tight and gray over a skull too long, too narrow. Eyes sunk so deep they were nearly black holes, catching no light at all. And a mouth that opened far past where a jaw should stop. Rows of blackened teeth behind lips cracked like frozen earth. It recoiled from the light with a shriek that felt less like sound and more like pressure behind her eyes, and in that half second of retreat, Elena ran. She didn't get far before she nearly collided with someone coming the other way. Ranger Marcus Whitefield, a broad-shouldered 10-year veteran who trained her when she first started, caught her by the shoulders before she could bowl him over. He had a headlamp of his own and a rifle slung across his back. And behind him, 2 more flashlight beams bounced through the trees. Dispatch had finally gotten enough signal through to send backup after all, 30 minutes too late to matter, and Elena would later think 30 minutes too early to be safe. Chocho, what happened? Your radio's been dead for. We need to go. Now. All of us. Back to the trailhead. Her voice didn't sound like her own. Too flat, too fast. Marcus frowned. The particular frown of a man who has spent a decade believing wilderness problems have wilderness explanations. We just got here. Dispatch said you found the tent. Where's the subject? I don't know. I don't, Marcus. There's something back there. It's not an animal. I saw it. I saw its face. The 2 rangers behind Marcus, younger, newer, exchanged a look that Elena recognized instantly, because she'd worn it herself 100 times over 6 years, the look of people deciding, politely, that a colleague was overreacting. Ja, liet's den. Marcus kept his voice level, the way you talk someone off a ledge. Cold does things to people out here. Hypothermia, adrenaline, low blood sugar, it plays tricks. We'll regroup, get you warmed up, and the temperature dropped 6 degrees in the time it took him to finish the sentence. All 4 of their thermometers registered at once. And for one long moment, nobody spoke, because a coincidence like that was harder to explain away than anything Elena had said. Then from somewhere in the dark behind them, back toward the tent, back toward the stacked white bones along the creek, came the breathing sound. Long, slow, patient, closer than it had been 40 minutes ago. Move, Elena said, and this time nobody argued. They ran as a group, headlamps cutting wild arcs through the trees, boots slipping on frost-slick roots, and Elena understood now why the thing hadn't chased her directly before it didn't need to. It simply arrived, closer each time a light swept past a gap in the trees, the way a shape appears in a strobe light between one flash and the next. Marcus was the one who went down first. His boot caught a root, and he sprawled hard into the frozen mud. And for 3 full seconds, none of them stopped running before some better instinct, the instinct that had kept Elena alive her whole career, dragged her back around to haul him up by the collar of his jacket. That was when she saw it clearly for the second time that night. And this time, in the combined beam of 4 headlamps, there was no mistaking any part of it. It stood at the tree line not 30 feet back, tall as the low branches, its skin the gray of ash and stretched so tight over an elongated skull that the shape of the bone showed through in ridges. Its ribs were visible beneath torn, frost-crusted flesh that might once, horribly, have been fabric of flannel shirt, degraded past recognition, still clinging in strips to a frame that had long since stopped being human in any way that mattered. Its eyes, when it turned them on her, held nothing. Not malice, not hunger, even despite the word it had spoken. Just an emptiness so total it felt like looking into a hole in the world. "That's not possible," one of the younger rangers whispered, and the thing's head snapped toward the sound of his voice with a speed that broke every law of biology Elena had ever studied. "Don't look at it," Elena said, hauling Marcus fully upright. "Don't run in a straight line. Move." They obeyed her without question this time. No room left for polite doubt, and the 4 of them crashed through the dark together, the creature's breathing rising behind them into something closer to a howl, a sound with no animal source Elena could name. Hollow and wet and enormous, the sound, she thought distantly, of a hunger old enough to have forgotten what it was hungry for. They didn't stop until the trailhead lights came into view, until their boots hit gravel instead of frozen creek bed, until all 4 of them were crammed into the 2 trucks with the doors locked and the engines running and nobody, for a long moment, able to say a single word. Elena's radio, silent for hours, crackled once more as she finally caught her breath. "Ranger, come back, still hungry." She reached over without a word and turned it off. Elena filed her report the next morning. Subject not located. Recommend trail closure pending further investigation. Extreme cold anomaly documented. Cause undetermined. She did not write down what she'd seen. She did not write down what she'd heard. She knew exactly how that report would read to her supervisor, and she knew exactly what would happen to her career if she put the word Tico on an official Park Service document. But she requested quietly, and without explanation, her superiors accepted never to be assigned to the Slough Creek sector again. Marcus never filed a report contradicting hers, and he never brought it up again either, not once, not even when they were alone. But Elena noticed that he stopped taking solo patrols after that night. She noticed the new thermometer he kept clipped inside his jacket, checking it obsessively even on warm afternoons. Some things you don't have to say out loud to someone for them to know you both saw the same impossible thing in the dark. 3 weeks later, a backcountry permit holder reported unusual elk carcasses near the same creek. Stripped clean, no claw marks, bones stacked, not scattered. Elena read the report at her desk and did not volunteer to investigate. She still hears it sometimes, late at night, when the temperature drops without warning and her apartment radiator ticks in a rhythm even to be mechanical. A slow, patient breathing just at the edge of hearing. It is still hungry. It is still waiting. And somewhere along Slough Creek, in the place where the elk bones lie stripped and white against the snow, something with Daniel Ferris's face still walks between the trees after dark watching the trail, waiting for the next person who wanders too far from the light and doesn't turn back in time. If this one got under your skin, smash that like button and subscribe. New horror story every week. And let me know in the comments, what's the one national park you'd never hike alone after watching this? 6 months had passed since Elena Cho watched something wearing the memory of a man's face disappear back into the tree line along Slough Creek. 6 months of transfer requests that got quietly denied, of avoiding the northern range on her days off, of telling herself the cold snap that night had simply been a freak weather pattern, nothing more, no matter how many nights she woke up certain she could hear breathing at the edge of her bedroom. She had thrown herself into desk work that winter. Permit processing, trail maintenance logs, wildlife survey data entry. Anything that kept her inside the ranger station with fluorescent lights overhead and other people's voices in the next room. Marcus noticed. He never said anything directly, but he started finding reasons to stop by her desk with coffee, the same easy, steady presence he'd always been, and Elena found she was grateful for it in a way she didn't examine too closely. Then, in early spring, a call came in that made her stomach drop before dispatch had even finished the sentence. A snowshoer named Rachel Kessler had gone missing near Pebble Creek, 11 miles east of Slough Creek, as the crow flies. Same district, same range. Her husband said she'd texted him one photo before her phone went dark, a picture of fresh tracks in the snow, tracks that were, in his words, almost human but way too long between steps, like something covering ground faster than a person's stride should allow. Elena stared at her supervisor's office door for a long moment before she made herself knock. Comment below if you think Elena should have walked away right there, because she didn't. And if you want to see what she found at Pebble Creek, make sure you're subscribed because this next part gets worse before it gets better. Elena requested to lead the search herself. Her supervisor, a soft-spoken man named Roy Delgado, who had never once questioned her strange insistence on staying off the Slough Creek sector, studied her for a long moment before agreeing. He didn't ask why. She suspected, in the way people sometimes sense things without wanting to name them, that some part of him already knew. Marcus Whitefield volunteered without being asked. He showed up at the trailhead an hour before dawn with a thermos of coffee neither of them touched, and a rifle he checked twice before they'd even started walking. Neither of them said the word Wendigo out loud. They didn't need to. It sat in the truck between them the whole drive out, silent and heavy as a passenger. Priya Anand had called Elena 2 weeks earlier, out of nowhere, just to check in. She'd moved to Bozeman, started therapy, was trying to build something like a normal life again after Daniel. She told Elena she still couldn't sleep with the window open, still couldn't shake the feeling that something out past the tree was patient enough to wait for her forever. Elena hadn't told her the feeling was correct. She hadn't needed to. Some things people already know in their bodies long before their minds catch up. The temperature that morning read a completely normal 36 degrees, and Elena found that somehow more unsettling than the cold snap had been, as if whatever they were walking toward had learned, in 6 months, to hide itself better. They found Rachel Kessler's snowshoes an hour and a half in, standing upright in the snow side by side, as neatly placed as if she had simply stepped out of them and floated away. No footprints leading from them in any direction. No that I've marks. No blood. Marcus crouched beside them, his breath fogging thick in the cold. This is exactly like Ferris's tent. Everything left in order. Nothing taken except the person. Elena didn't answer. She was staring past him, at a line of aspens 50 yards off where the bark had been stripped in long vertical gouges, pale wood showing raw underneath, starting about 7 feet up and running down to the roots. Too high for anything that walked on 4 legs. Too deliberate to be weather damage. They photographed the snowshoes, marked the coordinates, and continued east, following a set of tracks that shouldn't have been there at all. The tracks were unmistakably bipedal, but the stride length between each print measured, when Elena knelt to check it against her own boot for scale, nearly 9 feet. No human being alive could cover that kind of distance per step without running, and these prints showed no sign of running at all. Just a slow, deliberate, impossibly long walk. 20 minutes later, the tracks simply stopped at the base of an enormous Douglas fir, as if whatever made them had climbed straight up into the canopy and vanished. Marcus tilted his headlamp upward into the branches and found nothing but empty pine boughs swaying gently in a wind neither of them could feel at ground level. "We keep going," Elena said before Marcus could suggest otherwise, and they picked up a second trail of evidence 100 yards further on, not tracks this time, but a scattering of small personal items laid out with the same unnerving neatness as everything else that night. A single glove, a granola bar wrapper, empty, folded into a careful square. A hair tie. Someone's leaving us a trail, Marcus said quietly. Or something's leading us somewhere it wants us to go. They found the second sign of Rachel 20 minutes later, further along a frozen creek bed that didn't appear on any official trail map Elena carried. A single boot, cut open along the side seam with something sharper than a blade, should have any right to be, sitting alone atop a flat gray stone as if it had been placed there for them to find, as if something wanted them to keep following. Marcus voiced the thought Elena had been holding back all morning. It's leading us somewhere. Or it's hungry again, Elena said, and neither of them added anything after that. They followed the marked trail of stripped bark and strange half-human tracks for nearly 2 more hours, moving deeper into a section of backcountry so remote that Elena's GPS unit began throwing coordinates that didn't line up with any map grid she recognized. Her compass needle drifted lazily instead of settling, the way Marcus's had done once before, years earlier, during a search he'd never fully explained to her. The forest here felt older somehow, the lodgepole pines taller and closer together, blocking out enough daylight that Marcus finally switched his headlamp on despite it being barely past noon. At one point, they crossed what Elena was almost certain was the same stretch of creek they'd passed 40 minutes earlier. The same oddly shaped boulder jutting from the ice, the same fallen log split down its center. Marcus checked his own GPS and found the same impossible discrepancy she had. They were, according to their instruments, in 2 places at once, or moving in a loop too subtle to notice with the eye alone. Neither of them said the word aloud, but both of them understood, with the same cold certainty, that the forest itself no longer wanted to be measured. That was when they heard it. Not the low, breathing sound from 6 months earlier, but something worse. A voice. Rachel Kessler's voice, calling out from somewhere ahead, thin and confused and utterly human. Hello, is someone there? I'm so cold. Please, I can't find the trail. Marcus started forward immediately. Elena grabbed his arm hard enough to bruise. That's not her, she said. Listen to it. It's too even. People who are actually lost and freezing don't sound like that. Marcus hesitated, torn between 6 months of trusting Elena completely and every instinct telling him a woman needed help 50 yards away. The voice called out again, closer this time, catching on something that might have been a sob. Please, I have a daughter. She's 4. Please don't leave me out here. Elena felt something twist painfully in her chest, because whatever was doing this, whatever was using Rachel Kessler's voice and Rachel Kessler's daughter as bait, it had done its research. It had listened. It knew exactly which words would work. We're not going toward that voice, Elena said. We're going to find the actual tracks and follow them the way we planned. If Rachel is really out there, this is the wrong direction to find her alive. It took every ounce of authority Elena had built over 6 years to make Marcus nod and lower his rifle. The voice called out 3 more times as they backed away, each time a little angrier, a little less convincingly human, until on the last call the pitch dropped so low it barely sounded like a voice at all anymore. Just a vibration that seemed to come up through the frozen ground itself, rattling loose snow from the branches overhead. They moved in the opposite direction for nearly 20 minutes, following the real trail of stripped bark and impossible footprints, and the temperature dropped steadily the entire time, degree by degree, until their breath came out in thick white clouds, and the frost on Marcus's beard had begun to form small icicles. Elena's hands had gone numb inside her gloves, but she kept walking because stopping felt, for reasons she couldn't fully articulate, more dangerous than the cold itself. The trail ended abruptly at the edge of a small clearing Elena didn't recognize from any map. A perfect circle of bare frozen ground roughly 30 feet across, ringed by trees whose lowest branches had all been stripped clean in identical vertical gouges, as though something had marked its territory with methodical, patient precision. In the center of the clearing lay Rachel Kessler, curled on her side in the snow, unmoving. Marcus reached her first, dropping to his knees and pressing gloved fingers to her throat, calling out that she had a pulse, faint but steady. Elena knelt on Rachel's other side, already reaching for her radio to call in the medevac, and that was when Rachel's eyes opened. This part of the story is the one Elena has never told anyone outside of her official report, because the official report only says a subject located, unresponsive, extreme hypothermia, and does not mention what Rachel's eyes looked like when she opened them, black all the way through with no white left at all, or the way she smiled up at Elena from the snow with a mouth that had somehow grown too many teeth for the shape of it to be right. Rachel didn't attack them. She simply looked at Elena with that wrong, patient smile and said 4 words in a voice made of 2 voices layered together. "You should have followed." Then her eyes closed, and when the medevac helicopter finally reached them 90 minutes later, Rachel Kessler was breathing shallow and human and confused, with no memory of anything past stepping out of her snowshoes that morning, and eyes that were, once again, an ordinary brown. Marcus never mentioned what he'd seen in Rachel's face either, not in his own report, not to Roy Delgado, not even in the truck on the long, silent drive back to the station. But Elena noticed the way his hands shook slightly around the steering wheel the entire way, the same tremor she'd felt in her own hands 6 months earlier outside a different clearing, holding a different journal. Some experiences don't need to be spoken aloud between 2 people to be understood completely. Rachel spent 4 days in the hospital in Cody, treated for hypothermia and mild frostbite on 2 fingers, and was discharged with instructions to rest and a prescription she never filled because she told the attending physician she didn't feel cold anymore at all, hadn't felt cold once since she woke up in that helicopter. The doctor wrote it off as shock. Elena, reading the discharge notes weeks later, out of a compulsion she couldn't quite explain to herself, felt something colder than the Yellowstone winter settle behind her ribs. She drove out to see Rachel once, about a month after the incident, telling herself it was a standard follow-up wellness check, the kind rangers sometimes did informally after a difficult rescue. Rachel answered the door of her small house outside, Cody looking healthy, rested, entirely normal, except for one detail that made Elena's throat go dry the moment she noticed it. On the kitchen windowsill behind her sat a small dish of raw meat, untouched, flies gathering at its edges in a way no sane household would allow. "I don't really eat regular food much anymore," Rachel said, following Elena's gaze with an expression that was almost apologetic. "Some kind of appetite thing, my doctor calls it. I just get these cravings now. Isn't that strange?" Elena did not stay for coffee. She told Rachel to call if anything else felt strange, gave her a business card she suspected would never be used, and drove back toward Mammoth with the heater running full blast the entire way, unable to shake the cold that had settled in her chest the moment she'd seen that dish on the windowsill. Elena never told the medical team what she'd seen in those first few minutes at the clearing. She has spent every day since wondering whether she imagined it, whether the cold and the fear had finally cracked something loose in her own mind the way it apparently had in Daniel Ferris, whether 6 years in this park had simply worn down some protective barrier in her that most people never have to test. But some nights, when her apartment radiator ticks too evenly and the temperature drops without explanation, Elena Cho lies awake and listens for a particular kind of breathing at the edge of hearing, patient and hollow and endlessly hungry. And she remembers 4 words spoken in a dead calm voice with a mouth that had far too many teeth. "You should have followed." She has not gone back to the northern range since. She does not think she ever will. but she has started keeping a folder in her desk drawer at the station, quietly, without telling anyone, of every unusual missing persons report that comes in from anywhere within 50 miles of Slough Creek. The folder is growing thicker than she would like to admit, and somewhere out past Pebble Creek, in a clearing that appears on no official map, the ground stays bare through every snowfall, as if something underneath refuses to let anything grow there at all, patient and old and still. After everything, endlessly hungry. If this story kept you up at night, hit that like button right now and subscribe for the next installment, because Rachel Kessler is not the last name that's going to come across Elena's desk. And drop a comment telling me whether you think Elena made the right call ignoring that voice, or whether some part of you thinks she should have run toward it anyway. Ranger Amy Hart got the call a little after 9 in the evening, the kind of hour when most search requests could wait until morning, except this one came with a detail that made her supervisor tell her to head out right away. A camper named Tom Reyes had walked away from his fire that afternoon to collect more wood and never came back. His hiking partner, a man named John Diaz, had waited 2 hours before hiking out to find signal and call it in. Amy had been assigned to the Eastern District for just over 2 years, a transfer she'd requested after a difficult season working search and rescue further south, closer to the busier trailheads where tourists went missing with almost predictable regularity. This district was quieter, older growth forest with fewer maintained trails, the kind of place that attracted serious backpackers rather than day hikers looking for a photo. She'd liked that about it at first, the sense that the people she rescued out here usually deserved a little more credit for bad luck than bad planning. Lately, though, something about the Eastern Ravine section had started bothering her in ways she couldn't fully articulate to her supervisor. Small things. Trail cameras that came back with corrupted footage on nights when nothing should have triggered them. A pair of hunters who'd reported hearing something calling out in a human voice from deep in the trees, repeating a name neither of them recognized, over and over, patient and unhurried. She'd filed those reports the way she filed everything, professionally, without editorializing, and try not to think about them too hard on her own solo patrols. What made tonight's call urgent wasn't just the missing time. It was what John kept repeating on the phone, over and over, in a voice that dispatch described as somewhere between confused and terrified. He said Tom had come back to camp twice already. Both times, John said it wasn't really him. Amy drove out to the trailhead with that detail sitting uneasily in her chest the whole way. She'd worked search and rescue for 9 years across 3 different parks, and she'd heard plenty of strange things said by frightened, exhausted people. Cold and isolation did things to the mind. But something about the flat certainty in John's voice, even secondhand through a dispatcher's notes, stuck with her in a way she couldn't shake. She met John at the trailhead a little after 10. He was sitting on the tailgate of his truck, wrapped in a blanket someone had given him, hands still shaking slightly even though the night wasn't especially cold. He was maybe 30, athletic build, the kind of experienced backpacker who didn't usually rattle easily. Right now, he looked like a man who hadn't blinked in an hour. "Tell me what happened," Amy said, keeping her voice level and calm, the tone she used for every panicked hiker she'd ever talked down. John rubbed his hands over his face before he answered. "We set up camp around 4. Normal stuff, nothing weird. Tom went to grab more wood a little before 6. Said he'd be back in 15 minutes. He wasn't. I called for him for a while, figured he probably found a good spot for pictures. He does that sometimes, gets distracted. Then what? He came back around 7. Camp was already getting dark. I saw him walking up through the trees, and I was relieved, honestly, until he got close enough that I could see his face properly." John stopped there for a long moment, staring at his own hands. His face was right, Amy. It was completely his face. But his eyes weren't blinking normal, and he was smiling the whole time In this way, Tom never smiles, like too wide, held too long, like someone had told him to smile, and he was doing exactly what he was told and nothing more. He asked me if I was hungry. Just kept asking over and over, "Are you hungry? Are you hungry?" in this voice that sounded like him, but the rhythm was wrong, like he'd learned to talk by listening through a wall. "What did you do?" I told him I wasn't hungry and asked where he'd been. He didn't answer that. He just kept smiling and asking the same question, closer each time, until I grabbed the hatchet from our gear and told him to stay back. He stopped then, just stood there at the edge of the firelight for maybe a full minute, still smiling. And then he turned and walked back into the trees like nothing had happened. Amy kept her expression neutral. The professional mask she'd built over years of hearing difficult things, even though something cold had started working its way up the back of her neck. "And you said he came back twice." John nodded. Second time was maybe an hour later. Same thing. Same smile. Except this time he had blood on his hands, dried, like it had been there a while, and he was carrying something I didn't want to look at too closely. I didn't wait around to find out what it was. I grabbed my pack and I ran for the trailhead, and I didn't stop until I hit cell signal. Amy asked him one more question before standing to head into the trees herself. Did he say anything else the second time? John's jaw tightened. He said, "Come find me, John. I'm still hungry." Same exact rhythm as before, patient, almost gentle, like he was inviting me to dinner instead of standing there covered in blood. That's when I ran. I'm not ashamed of that. I don't care how it looks. I ran. Amy radioed for a second ranger to meet her partway, in a longtime colleague named Dale Ferris who'd worked this district even longer than she had, and the two of them started up the trail together a little after 11, headlamps cutting narrow tunnels of light through a forest that felt, almost immediately, wrong in a way Amy couldn't fully name. The quiet was too complete. No owls, no wind. Not even the small rustling sounds of nocturnal animals moving through underbrush that usually filled a forest at night. Dale had been with the park nearly 20 years, long enough that Amy had learned early on to trust his read on a situation over almost anyone else's, including her own instincts sometimes. He didn't spook easily, didn't exaggerate, and rarely spoke more than necessary out on a call. Tonight, though, he'd been unusually quiet the entire hike in, and when Amy finally asked him directly whether anything about this felt familiar to him, he was silent for a long moment before answering. "There was a case years back before you transferred out here. Hiker went missing near this same ravine. We never found him. His partner told a story almost exactly like the one John just told us, and I filed it under exposure and exhaustion because that's what you do when the alternative doesn't fit inside a report. I haven't thought about it in years. I didn't want to." Amy absorbed that in silence, the cold settling deeper into her chest with every step closer to the campsite. "Why didn't you ever mention it before tonight?" "Because saying it out loud makes it real," Dale said simply, and didn't elaborate further. They reached the abandoned campsite 40 minutes later. The fire had burned down to low embers, still faintly glowing. Tom's pack sat exactly where he must have left it that afternoon, tent zipped shut, everything undisturbed except for one detail that made Amy's stomach turn the moment her headlamp caught it. A trail of something dark, dried into the pine needles, leading away from the fire ring into the trees, thick enough and long enough that it hadn't come from a small cut. Dale crouched beside it, examining the pattern with the same careful attention Amy had seen him apply to 100 less strange scenes over the years. This isn't drag marks. It's like something was carried, dripping the whole way. Whoever it was, they were already hurt before they went into those trees. They followed it a short distance further and found something that made both of them stop walking entirely. A second set of footprints ran parallel to the blood trail, barefoot, human-sized, but spaced unnaturally far apart, as though whoever made them had covered ground in long, deliberate strides no ordinary gait could produce. The prints showed no sign of hesitation, No wandering, no searching. They moved in an almost perfectly straight line, purposeful in a way that unsettled Amy more than the blood had. Dale looked up at her, headlamp beam catching the tension in his face. That's not an injured man walking. That's something that knows exactly where it's going. They followed the trail for nearly a mile, moving slowly, calling Tom's name every few minutes and getting nothing back but their own voices swallowed by the unnatural quiet. The trail eventually led them to a small rock outcropping overlooking a shallow ravine, and it was there that Dale's flashlight beam caught movement at the tree line across the gap, close enough to make out a human shape standing motionless among the trunks. "Tom," Amy called out, feeling foolish and afraid in equal measure. "It's Ranger Hart. Are you hurt?" The shape did not answer immediately. Then it took one slow step forward into a patch of moonlight, and Amy understood, with a cold certainty that settled in her chest like a stone, exactly what John Diaz had been trying to describe. It looked like Tom Reyes. The build was right, the clothing matched what was listed on his permit. Even the general shape of his face resembled the photo in his file. But everything about the way it held itself was wrong, too still, too balanced, weight distributed in a way that no exhausted, injured hiker would naturally stand. And when it smiled at them across the ravine, the expression stretched too wide and held too long, exactly the way John had described, an expression built by something that had studied smiling rather than something that simply felt like smiling. "Are you hungry?" It called back, in a voice that carried Tom's exact tone and pitch, but none of his natural rhythm, each word placed with unnerving evenness, like a recording played back slightly too slow. Dale's hand moved instinctively to the radio on his belt, and static answered before he could even key the mic, a low, continuous hiss that had not been there a moment earlier. Amy felt the temperature around them drop several degrees in the span of a few seconds, quick enough that her breath began fogging visibly in front of her. "We need to move," Amy said quietly, keeping her eyes on the shape across the ravine. "Slowly. Don't run yet." The thing wearing Tom's face tilted its head at an angle that a human neck shouldn't comfortably allow, still smiling, still watching them with an attention that felt less like recognition and more like evaluation, the way a predator considers whether prey is worth the effort of pursuit. It took a single step down into the ravine, unhurried, almost casual, and Amy noticed with a fresh wave of dread that its feet made no sound at all against the loose rock and dry brush. No crunch, no shifting stones, nothing but a silence that felt deliberately wrong. "Do you know what it feels like?" the shape said, drawing closer with that same eerie evenness to want something so badly that wanting is the only thing left of you. I remember wanting things once. Now I only want one thing. It's so much simpler this way. You'd understand if you let me show you. Neither ranger answered. Amy kept backing them both toward the trail, refusing to break eye contact with the shape, even as her boots found uneven ground beneath the pine needles. Dale's grip on the hatchet had gone white-knuckled, though neither of them had discussed using it, both of them seeming to understand instinctively that violence against something like this might do considerably less good than simple distance. Then, without any visible transition, without taking a single additional step that either ranger could actually track with their eyes, it was simply closer, near enough now that Amy could make out details that made her skin crawl. The eyes reflected no light at all, holding a flat darkness that didn't match the moonlight bouncing off everything else around them. Dale grabbed Amy's arm, and they moved together, fast but controlled, backing away from the ravine edge and cutting through the trees toward the trail they'd followed in. Behind them, they heard something start moving through the underbrush, not clumsy or loud the way a person crashing through darkness would be, but smooth and fast, closing distance with a controlled, patient efficiency that felt far more frightening than any panic chase would have. They ran the last quarter mile back to the original campsite, and the fire, though they'd left it low and dying, was now burning high and bright, as if someone had fed it fresh wood in their absence. Standing beside it, waiting for them with that same too wide smile, stood the thing wearing Tom Reyes's face. "It's not him," Dale said quietly, more to himself than to Amy, his hand tightening around the hatchet he'd taken from Tom's own gear pile. "Whatever we're looking at, it's not him anymore." The shape spoke again, its voice layering slightly this time, as though two people were speaking in near perfect unison a half-second apart. "I remember being hungry. I remember the cold. Now I don't feel anything at all. Isn't that wonderful? You could feel that too. All you have to do is stop running." It gestured, almost gently, toward the tent still standing behind it. Tom's boots still lined up neatly at the entrance exactly as they'd found them hours earlier. "There's room here for both of you. It's peaceful once you stop fighting it. I promise you that much." Amy did not answer. She had spent 9 years learning that engaging with a threat verbally sometimes bought time, sometimes de-escalated a dangerous situation, but every instinct she had was screaming that this particular threat operated by rules that didn't include reasoning or mercy. She grabbed Dale's sleeve and pulled him wide around the fire, giving the thing as much distance as the terrain allowed, moving toward the trail that led back to the vehicles. It let them go. That was, in some ways, the detail that unsettled Amy most in the weeks that followed. It did not chase them down the mile and a half back to the trailhead. It simply stood beside the fire, watching them retreat, still smiling that same unnatural smile, until the trees finally blocked it from view. The last thing Amy heard, faint and carried on air that shouldn't have moved at all given how still the night had been, was a single word repeated softly, almost tenderly, fading the further they got. "Hungry, hungry, hungry." They reached the trailhead a little after 2 in the morning. John Diaz was still there, wrapped in his blanket, and the relief on his face at seeing them return unharmed collapsed almost immediately into fresh fear when he saw their expressions. "You saw it too," he said. "It wasn't just me." Amy filed her official report that morning listing Tom Reyes as missing, presumed lost in difficult terrain, and recommended the Eastern Ravine section be closed to backcountry permits, pending further investigation into unstable ground conditions. She did not write down anything about a smile that held too long, or a voice that spoke in unnatural rhythm, or eyes that reflected no light at all. Dale never brought it up directly after that night, either, though Amy noticed he stopped taking solo overnight patrols entirely, always finding a partner or a reason to reschedule when solo coverage came up in that district. Search teams combed the area for 9 days. They found no further trace of Tom Reyes, no body, no additional blood trail, nothing beyond the original campsite evidence already documented. The case remains open, technically, filed under circumstances no report will ever fully capture. John Diaz moved out of state within the month. He called Amy once, nearly a year later, just to ask if anything else strange had ever come out of that section of the park. Amy told him no, which was not entirely true, because 2 more solo hikers had gone quiet on that same eastern trail since then, both eventually found wandering confused near the trailhead days later with no memory of where they'd been. Both of them, according to responding rangers, smiling just slightly too wide when questioned about it. Dale retired from the Park Service 18 months after that night, earlier than most people expected given how much he'd always talked about working until they forced him out. He never gave Amy a full explanation, just told her over coffee at his going-away lunch that some places stop feeling worth the risk once you've seen what's actually watching from the trees, and that he'd rather spend his remaining years somewhere the woods kept their secrets to themselves. Amy understood exactly what he meant, even though neither of them said Tom's name at the lunch or the ravine or anything else about that night at all. Amy still works that district. She still patrols near the ravine sometimes, during daylight, never alone, never after dark. She keeps a private log now, something she started a few months after the incident and has never shown anyone, noting every strange report that comes out of the Easter Trail system, no matter how minor it seems on the surface. The log has grown longer than she likes to admit, filled with small, easily dismissed details that, taken together, tell a story she has never once put into an official report. And sometimes, on quiet nights back at the station, she finds herself wondering whether the thing that walked out of those trees wearing Tom Reyes's face is even the same thing that first found him, or whether it simply borrows whoever wanders close enough, wearing them like a coat until it needs something to smile with again, patient and unhurried, content to wait in that quiet stretch of forest for as long as it takes for the next person to walk too far from the fire. 10 months after the night at the ravine, Amy Hart still kept her private log locked in the bottom drawer of her desk at the ranger station, a battered notebook filled with small, dismissible details that, taken together, painted a picture she had never once put into an official report. Trail cameras with corrupted footage, hunters describing a voice calling out names from deep in the trees, two confused hikers found wandering the trailhead days after vanishing, both smiling just slightly too wide when questioned about where they'd been. She had grown almost used to the low hum of dread that lived permanently now somewhere behind her ribs whenever she thought about the Eastern District. Almost used to it, but never comfortable with it, the way a person learns to live beside a chronic pain without ever quite forgetting it's there. The call came in on a Thursday afternoon in early October, ordinary in every way except for the name attached to it. A father named Paul Martinez had reported his 16-year-old son missing after the two of them got separated on a day hike near the same Eastern Ravine trail Amy had personally recommended closing nearly a year earlier. The trail had, in fact, been closed, marked with warning signs about unstable terrain, but Paul explained through tears on the phone that his son Eli had wandered past the barrier chasing after a dog that had slipped its leash, and Paul, calling after him, had lost sight of both boy and dog within minutes. Amy felt something cold settle into her stomach the moment dispatch read her the coordinates. It was almost exactly the same stretch of forest where she and Dale had followed Tom Reyes's blood trail down into the ravine that night. The same quiet, wrong section of woods that had sat undisturbed and dangerous behind its warning signs for the better part of a year. She called Dale before she'd even finished lacing her boots. He picked up on the second ring, and something in his voice told her he already knew, before she'd said more than a few words, exactly what kind of call this was going to be. "I'll meet you at the trailhead," he said simply. "Give me 20 minutes." Paul Martinez was waiting for them when they arrived, pacing a tight circle in the gravel parking lot, his phone gripped so hard in one hand that his knuckles had gone pale. He was maybe 45, dressed in ordinary hiking gear, the kind of casual outdoor competence that suggested he and his son did this often enough to know better than to ignore trail closures, which made the fact that he'd let it happen anyway sit heavier in Amy's chest. He crossed the lot the moment he saw their uniforms. "Please, you have to find him. He's only 16. He doesn't know these trails the way I do. He's never been out here after dark." Amy kept her voice steady, the same practice calm she used with every frightened parent she'd ever met on a call like this one. "We're going to find him. Tell me exactly what happened. Everything you remember, even the small stuff." Paul described it in halting fragments. They'd been hiking the main loop, well within the marked boundaries, when their dog Buster had slipped his collar chasing a squirrel and bolted toward the closed section of trail. Eli had gone after him without thinking, calling back that he'd only be a minute, and Paul had followed as far as the warning sign before losing sight of his son entirely in the thickening trees. He'd called out for over an hour before finally getting enough signal to phone for help. "Did you hear anything unusual?" Amy asked carefully, choosing her words with the kind of caution she'd learned to apply to every question in that particular stretch of forest. anything that sounded strange or out of place. Paul hesitated, and in that hesitation Amy felt the same cold certainty she'd felt in John Diaz's voice 10 months earlier. Just before I lost cell signal completely, I thought I heard Eli calling back to me. But it sounded wrong. Too calm, considering he was supposedly lost in the woods after dark. He just kept saying he was fine, over and over in this flat voice that didn't sound like him at all. I called out to come toward my voice, and he just stopped answering completely. Dale and Amy exchanged a look that carried 10 months of unspoken understanding between them, and neither of them said out loud what they were both already thinking. They organized the search quickly, bringing in 2 additional rangers and a K-9 unit before the light failed completely. Though Amy insisted, over some resistance from a younger colleague named Ryan who didn't yet understand why, that no one was to search that section of trail alone under any circumstances. The search dog picked up Eli's scent almost immediately at the warning sign boundary, tracking steadily into the closed section of forest with the confident, businesslike energy of an animal that hadn't yet encountered anything to make it hesitate. Amy walked close behind the handler, flashlight sweeping the underbrush on either side of the trail, every sense straining for any hint of the wrongness she remembered from 10 months earlier. The quiet arrived exactly the way she remembered it. No birds, no wind. Even the K-9 handler noticed it eventually, glancing back at Amy with a slight frown, murmuring something about how still the forest had gotten in just the last few minutes. They found Buster the dog first, sitting calmly at the edge of the ravine overlook, completely unharmed, tail wagging as though nothing at all had happened in the hours since he'd bolted from Paul's side. He showed no sign of injury, no sign of exhaustion, nothing to suggest he'd spent hours lost in unfamiliar terrain. He simply sat there, waiting, watching the tree line across the ravine with an alertness that made the hair on Amy's arm stand up. Ryan crouched to check the dog over, running gentle hands along its sides, and looked up at Amy with obvious confusion. He's fine. Better than fine, honestly. No burrs, no scrapes, nothing. It's like he's been sitting right here the whole time waiting for someone to come get him. Amy didn't answer immediately. She was looking past Ryan, out across the ravine to the same tree line where she and Dale had first seen the thing wearing Tom Reyes's face, and something in the darkness over there seemed to be looking back. "Dale," she said quietly, keeping her voice level for the benefit of the other rangers who didn't yet know what they might be walking toward. "I think we need to call this in as a 2-person approach, only effective immediately. Whoever's not directly on the ravine edge stays back with the K-9 team and Paul." The younger ranger started to protest, something about needing full coverage for an active search, and Dale cut him off with a firmness Amy rarely heard from him. "Just do what she says. Trust me on this one." Amy and Dale crossed carefully along the safer upper edge of the ravine, headlamps cutting narrow beams through darkness that felt, once again, deliberately thick in a way ordinary night shouldn't allow. They called Eli's name every few minutes, getting nothing back but their own voices swallowed whole by that same unnatural silence. They found him nearly 30 minutes later, sitting motionless on a flat outcropping of rock overlooking the ravine, exactly the kind of spot a curious 16-year-old might climb to for a better view, except that Eli was sitting in a posture no cold, frightened teenager would naturally hold, spine too straight, hands folded neatly in his lap, staring out at absolutely nothing with an expression Amy recognized immediately and had hoped, desperately, she would never see again. "Eli," she called out gently, approaching slowly with her hands visible and open, the same careful posture she'd use with anyone in shock. "It's Ranger Hart. Your dad's worried sick about you. Can you hear me?" The boy turned his head toward her with a smoothness that didn't match the stiff, careful posture of his body, and smiled at her, wide and held too long, exactly the way Tom Reyes's borrowed face had smiled at her 10 months earlier. "I'm not lost," he said, in a voice that carried the right pitch for a 16-year-old boy, but none of the natural unevenness a real, frightened teenager's voice would have. I found something. It's been waiting for someone to find it for a really long time. Dale's hand moved to his radio out of pure habit, and static answered immediately, thick and continuous, drowning out whatever he might have tried to say into it. The temperature around them dropped fast enough that Amy's breath began fogging visibly within seconds, the cold arriving with the same deliberate quality she remembered from the ravine 10 months earlier, less like weather and more like an announcement. "Eli, listen to me," Amy said carefully, forcing steadiness into her voice despite every instinct screaming that this conversation was already going wrong. "I need you to stand up slowly and come toward me. Can you do that for me?" The boy tilted his head at an angle that made something in Amy's stomach turn over completely, an angle that no comfortable human neck should allow, still smiling that same unervingly wide smile. "Why would I want to leave? It's so quiet here. It doesn't want anything from me except company. That's more than most people ever offer." Movement caught Amy's eye at the tree line across the ravine, the same spot where she'd first seen the thing wearing Tom's face all those months earlier. A shape stepped out slowly into the thin moonlight, and though the build was different this time, taller, thinner, dressed in clothing Amy didn't recognize from any missing persons file she'd reviewed, the wrongness of it was immediately, sickeningly familiar. The same still posture, the same patient, evaluating attention, the same absolute absence of light reflecting in its eyes. "It's found more of them since Tom," Dale murmured beside her, almost too quiet to hear, his voice carrying a kind of exhausted horror that suggested some part of him had suspected this exact possibility for the past 10 months without ever saying it aloud. The shape did not approach directly. It simply stood at the tree line, watching, the same unhurried patience Amy remembered from before, as though it understood perfectly well that direct pursuit wasn't necessary, that whatever it wanted from them would arrive eventually, on its own schedule, without the effort of a chase. "Eli," Amy said again, more firmly this time, taking a careful step closer to the boy despite every nerve in her body telling her to keep her distance from anything connected to that shape across the ravine. "Your dad is waiting for you at the trailhead. He loves you. He's terrified something happened to you." Something in the boy's expression flickered at that. Just briefly, a crack of something more human moving beneath the too wide smile. There and gone so fast Amy might have imagined it if she hadn't been watching so closely. For a single unsettling moment his eyes seemed almost normal, almost frightened, almost exactly like a 16-year-old boy who had wandered somewhere he desperately wished he hadn't. "Dad," he said, in a voice that suddenly carried real uncertainty, the flat evenness cracking at the edges. "I don't remember how long I've been sitting here. Why can't I remember?" "That's it," Amy said gently, seizing the opening without knowing exactly what had caused it, keeping her voice as warm and steady as she could manage with her hands still faintly trembling at her sides. "Just focus on your dad's voice. Come toward me. You don't have to understand what happened right now. You just have to stand up and walk with me." The shape at the tree line made a sound then, low and displeased, something between a growl and the particular grating exhale Amy remembered from Tom's borrowed voice 10 months earlier. The temperature dropped another sharp degree, and Eli flinched visibly, his composed posture breaking for the first time, shoulders curling inward the way a genuinely frightened teenager's shoulders should. "It doesn't want me to go," he whispered, and this time his voice sounded entirely his own, young and scared and human in a way that made Amy's chest ache with relief, even as her pulse spiked with fresh fear. "It's been talking to me the whole time, telling me things. I thought I wanted to stay. I don't think I actually wanted that. I think it just kept telling me I did until I stopped being able to tell the difference." Dale stepped up beside Amy, positioning himself slightly between the boy and the tree line, hatchet held low but ready at his side. "We're leaving now. All three of us, together, right now, while it's still deciding whether to stop us." Eli scrambled up off the rock, outcropping on legs that seemed to remember, suddenly, how to shake with genuine cold and fear, and Amy grabbed his arm firmly, pulling him toward the safer trail behind them without waiting to see whether the shape across the ravine intended to follow. Dale moved backward alongside them, keeping his eyes on the tree line the entire time. The hatchet raised now in clear readiness, though none of them had any illusions about what good it might actually do against something that didn't obey the physics of ordinary distance. The shape did not cross the ravine. It stood at the tree line and watched them retreat, the same patient, unhurried attention Amy remembered, until the trail finally curved enough to block it from view entirely. The last sound that followed them out was not a growl or a shout, but something far more unsettling in its gentleness, a soft, almost tender call that carried Eli's own voice back at them, layered strangely, repeating 4 words with patient, endless calm. "Come back and stay." They didn't stop moving until they reached Paul Martinez waiting anxiously at the trail boundary with Ryan and the K9 team, and the sound of Paul's relieved sob as he pulled his son into a fierce hug was, for a brief moment, enough to push back some of the cold that had settled so deeply into Amy's chest over the previous hour. Eli spent 2 days in observation at the regional hospital, treated for mild hypothermia and shock, and was released with instructions to rest and follow up with a counselor about the disorientation he described experiencing during his hours lost in the ravine. He remembered almost nothing clearly from that time, just fragments, a sense of being spoken to gently and persistently by something he couldn't picture clearly even in memory, and a persistent, lingering feeling that whatever it had been, it had not wanted to hurt him so much as simply keep him. Amy filed her report listing the incident as a successful recovery of a minor who had become disoriented after leaving the marked trail, and recommended the Eastern Ravine closure be extended indefinitely with additional signage and stronger physical barriers. Her supervisor approved the recommendation without much discussion, the same easy, incurious approval Amy had come to recognize as the particular kind of willful blindness that kept the Park Service running smoothly in places like this. Dale requested reassignment away from the Eastern District less than a month later, a transfer that was granted quickly and without much comment from anyone above him. He told Amy, over one final quiet dinner before he left, that he didn't think either of them was ever going to get a real answer about what lived out there, and that some questions, once you understood you'd never actually get to close them, were better left at a distance rather than carried around every single day. Amy stayed. She told herself it was because someone needed to, because leaving felt like abandoning a problem to whichever unlucky ranger got assigned next. Someone who wouldn't know to keep their distance, wouldn't recognize the smile that held too long or the voice with the wrong rhythm until it was already too late to matter. She still keeps her private log, longer now than it was a year ago, filled with careful, dispassionate notes about a section of forest that officially exists only as a hazard warning on a trail map, but that Amy understands with a certainty she has stopped trying to talk herself out of, as something considerably more patient and considerably more awake than any hazard sign could ever properly describe. Sometimes, on the quietest nights back at the station, she thinks about Eli's voice carrying back to them across the ravine, gentle and layered and endlessly patient, and she wonders how many other names it has learned to call by now, and how long it intends to keep waiting for someone to finally answer. Ranger Jake Sutton had worked the Devil's Hollow District for just under a year when he first heard the local name for the light. Not from any official park document, not from any training manual, but from an old man named Pete Yin who ran the general store just outside the southern entrance and had lived in the shadow of these mountains his whole life. They call it the Lantern. Pete had told him one slow afternoon, ringing up Jake's coffee and sandwich without much ceremony. Been showing up out past the hollow for longer than anybody can properly account for. My granddad saw it as a boy. Said it looks like someone walking with an oil lamp, moving through the trees at a steady pace, like they know exactly where they're headed. Problem is, nobody who's ever followed it has come back the same. Jake had leaned against the counter that afternoon, half listening, half distracted by the stack of paperwork waiting for him back at the station. What do you mean, not the same? Pete had considered the question carefully before answering, the way a man considers something he's turned over in his own mind many times without ever quite settling on the right words. Different accounts say different things. Some folks come back and just seem a little off, quieter than they used to be, like something got scooped out of them and never quite refilled. A few never come back at all. My granddad's cousin went missing chasing that light back in the 50s. They found his boots eventually, neat as you please, sitting right at the trail edge like he just stepped out of them and walked off into nothing. That story had stuck with Jake longer than he'd expected it to at the time. The specific detail of boots left behind so carefully, so deliberately, nagging at him in odd moments over the following months, even as he told himself repeatedly that mountain towns loved a good ghost story regardless of how much truth sat underneath it. He thought about it differently now, standing at the trailhead a little after midnight with his headlamp cutting a thin beam through fog that had rolled in low and thick across the parking lot, waiting for backup that felt suddenly very far away. The missing hiker was a woman named Emma Ruiz, 28 years old, an experienced backpacker who'd set out that morning for what should have been a simple 6-mile loop through Devil's Hollow before circling back to her car by early evening. Her boyfriend had called in around 10 that night, when she still hadn't returned or answered any of his texts. His voice tight with the particular worry of someone who knew his partner well enough to understand this wasn't like her. Jake had pulled her filed itinerary before heading out, memorized the loop trail, checked the weather, everything by the book. Nothing about the conditions explained why his radio had gone almost completely silent the moment he stepped past the trailhead sign. Nothing but a thin, persistent static that occasionally, if he listened too closely, seemed to carry the faint suggestion of a voice underneath it. He started up the main loop trail with his flashlight sweeping steadily side to side, calling Emma's name every few minutes into a fog so thick it swallowed the beam of light almost entirely past 10 feet. The quiet out here felt different than ordinary mountain quiet, heavier somehow, deliberate, the kind of silence that made a person feel watched even when nothing was visible in any direction. 40 minutes in, he saw the light. It hung low among the trees off to his right, a warm, steady amber glow that bobbed gently with the rhythm of someone walking, exactly the way a hand-carried lantern might sway with a person's stride. Jake's first thought was relief, pure and immediate, the assumption that some other hiker, or perhaps Emma herself, had a working light source and simply needed help finding the trail back. "Hello," he called out, angling his own flashlight toward the glow. "Park Ranger. Are you injured?" The light didn't answer, but it didn't flee either. It simply continued its steady pace, moving parallel to the trail at a distance of maybe 30 yards, neither approaching nor retreating, as though whoever carried it hadn't quite decided whether Jake was worth acknowledging. He followed it instinctively, the way any experienced searcher would follow any unexplained light source in a missing person case, telling himself the whole time that this was simply protocol, simply due diligence, nothing more. The trail beneath his boots grew rougher the further he went, roots and loose stone making the footing increasingly treacherous, until he realized with a small, cold jolt that he'd left the marked trail entirely without noticing exactly when it happened. He stopped walking. The light stopped too, hovering patiently in the fog, as though waiting for him to catch up. Jake pulled out his GPS, and the screen displayed coordinates that made no sense against his known position, numbers that drifted and recalculated every few seconds as though the device itself couldn't settle on where exactly he stood. His compass needle spun lazily instead of settling toward north, the way a compass behaves near a strong magnetic disturbance. Except there was no rational source for that kind of interference anywhere on record for this section of the park. "This is Ranger Sutton," he said into his radio, more out of habit than any real hope of it working. "I'm off trail, tracking an unexplained light source, requesting a check on my position if anyone's receiving this." Static answered him, thick and unbroken, and underneath it, faint but unmistakable now that he was listening for it directly, a voice. Not words exactly, more like the suggestion of words, a low murmuring cadence that rose and fell like conversation heard through a thick wall. The light moved again, further into the trees, and something about its patience, its willingness to wait exactly long enough for him to notice it slipping away, pulled at some instinct in Jake that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with an older, more primitive part of the brain that recognized bait when it saw it. He thought about Pete Yan's warning, sitting there in the general store with his coffee going cold. Nobody who's ever followed it has come back the same. Jake did not turn back. Whatever else was true about this light, about Pete's stories, about the strange silence pressing in around him, Emma Ruiz was still out here somewhere. And if there was even a small chance this light connected to wherever she'd gone, he owed her the effort of following it at least a little further. His radio crackled unexpectedly, a brief clear burst cutting through the static, and a voice he recognized as dispatch came through thin but audible. "Sutton, this is base. We're sending a second unit out to your last known position. Do you copy?" Jake nearly wept with relief at the sound of an ordinary human voice. "Copy, base. I'm off Mark Trail, tracking an unexplained light source northeast of the main loop. GPS isn't holding steady, so use my last confirmed coordinates and adjust from there. Be advised, conditions out here are strange. Tell whoever's coming to stick to pairs and keep radio contact constant." "Copy that, Sutton. Second unit is 20 minutes out. Stay on this channel if you can." The connection held for perhaps another 10 seconds before dissolving back into that same thick static, the reassuring voice swallowed up as completely as if it had never come through at all. Jake tried twice more to re-establish contact, got nothing, and finally clipped the radio back to his belt with a frustration that did little to mask the fresh unease settling into his chest. 20 minutes suddenly felt like a very long time. The terrain grew stranger the deeper he went. Trees that should have thinned as elevation increased instead grew thicker and older, ancient hemlocks with trunks wide enough that 3 people together couldn't have wrapped their arms fully around them. The fog thickened too, swirling in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, parting occasionally to reveal glimpses of terrain that didn't match any topographic feature Jake remembered from his year of patrolling this district. He found the first sign of Emma nearly an hour later. A single hiking pole standing upright in soft ground, planted with the kind of precision that suggested someone had placed it there deliberately rather than dropped it in a moment of panic. Jake photographed it, marked what GPS coordinates his malfunctioning device would give him, and kept moving, the light still bobbing patiently ahead of him through the trees. Then he heard her voice, calling from somewhere off to his left, thin and confused and unmistakably human. "Hello, is someone there? I've been walking for hours. I can't find a trail. Please, I'm so cold." Every instinct told Jake to run toward that sound immediately, but something about the memory of Pete Yan's careful, worried expression while telling that story held him back, some small, insistent voice reminding him that the light had led him off trail with exactly this kind of patient confidence, and that a genuine call for help from someone truly lost and frightened rarely sounded quite so evenly paced. "Emma," he called back instead, staying rooted where he stood. "I'm Ranger Sutton. If that's really you, tell me something only you would know, something for today's hike." There was a pause, longer than felt natural, before the voice answered again. And this time something in its rhythm had shifted, gone slightly too smooth, too composed for someone supposedly freezing and lost in unfamiliar woods after dark. I don't remember. Please just come find me. I'm so scared. I don't want to be alone out here anymore. Jake felt the temperature drop sharply around him, cold enough that his breath began fogging visibly despite the relatively mild night air just an hour earlier. The light ahead of him flickered once, brightened, and began moving directly toward him for the first time since he'd spotted it, closing distance with a slow, deliberate pace that felt far more unsettling than any sudden rush would have. He backed away instinctively, flashlight sweeping toward the approaching glow, and in that brief illumination he caught, for just a fraction of a second, something that made his blood run cold. The light wasn't a lantern at all. It hung suspended in midair with no visible source, no handle, no flame contained by any glass. Simply a floating orb of warm amber, glow pulsing faintly like something breathing. Beneath it, barely visible in the fog, stood a shape roughly the height and build of a person, though its edges seemed to blur and shift the longer Jake looked at it, as though his eyes couldn't quite settle on a fixed form. It made no sound as it moved, no footsteps, no rustling brush, simply gliding forward with the light hovering just above where a raised hand might be. Jake turned and ran. He didn't decide to. His body simply made the choice for him, some ancient survival instinct overriding every ounce of professional training that told him running blind through unfamiliar terrain at night was exactly the wrong response to almost any wilderness emergency. Branches tore at his jacket as he crashed through underbrush, his own flashlight beam bouncing wildly, throwing brief, disorienting glimpses of trees that seemed to lean in too close on either side of whatever path he was making for himself. Behind him, the light kept pace effortlessly, never gaining, never falling back, simply present at the edge of his vision, no matter how fast he moved, patient in a way that made the chase feel almost performative, as though it understood perfectly well that he had nowhere to actually escape to. He broke free of the trees, so suddenly he nearly stumbled into open air, finding himself at the edge of a small clearing he didn't recognize from any map of the district, ringed by the same impossibly old hemlocks. Moonlight breaking through the canopy here in a way it hadn't anywhere else along his desperate run. The light behind him seemed to hesitate at the clearing's edge, as though something about the open ground gave it pause, and Jake felt a brief, fragile surge of hope that this space, whatever it was, might offer some kind of boundary the thing couldn't easily cross. And there, in the center of the clearing, sat Emma Ruiz. She was conscious, sitting upright against a fallen log, her pack still on her shoulders, looking up at him with an expression of pure, exhausted relief that made Jake's chest ache with something between hope and dread in equal measure. "You're real," she said, her voice cracking. "Please tell me you're actually real this time." Jake crossed to her quickly, checking her over for injury, finding her cold and dehydrated, but otherwise unharmed. "What happened? How long have you been out here?" "I don't know exactly. I got turned around on the loop trail sometime this afternoon, and then I saw this light, thought it might be another hiker, followed it for a while before I realized I'd lost the actual trail completely." Emma's hands were shaking as she spoke, whether from cold or fear, Jake couldn't quite tell. "It kept leading me places. Sometimes I'd hear voices calling out, sounding like people I know, my sister, my boyfriend, but whenever I got close enough, it was never actually them. I stopped following it a while ago. Just sat down here and waited, figured moving around was making it worse." "That was smart," Jake said, meaning it completely, helping her to her feet despite muscles in his own legs still trembling from the run. "We need to move now, carefully, and stay together no matter what we hear or see." They started back the way Jake had come, moving as quickly as Emma's exhausted body allowed, and the fog seemed to thicken deliberately around them the moment they began walking, swirling in patterns that obscured landmarks Jake had used to orient himself only minutes earlier. The light reappeared almost immediately, hovering at the tree line ahead of them, no longer patient and distant, but positioned directly in their intended path, as though it had anticipated exactly which direction they would try to go. "We go around it," Jake said quietly, angling them off at a diagonal through denser brush rather than approaching the light directly. Emma nodded, gripping his arm tightly, and they pushed forward together through undergrowth that seemed to catch and pull at their clothing with unusual persistence. The light matched their new direction almost immediately, sliding smoothly through the fog to intercept them again. And this time the shape beneath it had grown more distinct, tall and thin, its edges still blurred but unmistakably humanoid now, moving with a fluid, unhurried grace that covered ground far faster than its casual pace should have allowed. It spoke then, and the voice that came from it layered strangely, carrying fragments of Emma's own voice mixed with something older and colder underneath. "Stay, just a little longer. There's so much to show you both." Emma flinched hard against Jake's side, recognition and horror crossing her face simultaneously. "That's the voice," she whispered. "That's exactly what it sounded like when it was pretending to be my sister." Jake pulled her sideways again, cutting through a gap in the fog where moonlight briefly broke through clearly enough to reveal actual trail markers, faded but unmistakably official Park Service blazes nailed to a tree ahead of them. Relief flooded through him at the sight, something concrete and human-made amid all this shifting, impossible terrain. "There," he said, pointing. "That's the main loop. If we can reach it, the trail should lead us back toward the trailhead, regardless of whatever's happening with the GPS." They ran the last stretch together, the light pursuing at that same maddening, unhurried pace just behind them. And Jake felt the exact moment they crossed back on a genuinely marked trail, a subtle shift in the ground beneath his boots, packed earth replacing the soft, uncertain footing of wherever they'd been wandering. The fog began thinning almost immediately, and the oppressive, watching silence that had pressed down on the forest for the past 2 hours started, gradually, to lift. The light did not follow them onto the marked trail. It hovered at the boundary where packed dirt met wild undergrowth, pulsing once, twice, and then winked out entirely, leaving nothing behind but ordinary darkness and the distant, real sound of wind moving through the canopy for the first time all night. They reached the trailhead a little before 3 in the morning, and the reunion between Emma and her waiting boyfriend was loud enough that Jake heard it from 50 yards out, relief and tears mixing together in a way that made his own exhaustion feel, briefly, entirely worthwhile. He filed his official report the next day, listing Emma Ruiz as located, safely recovered after becoming disoriented in dense fog conditions, and made no mention of a floating light, a shifting humanoid shape, or a voice that had worn her sister's borrowed tone like a costume. He recommended additional trail markers be installed through that section of Devil's Hollow, citing poor visibility during fog events as a contributing hazard. His supervisor approved the recommendation without much discussion, the same kind of easy, incurious approval Jake was slowly starting to understand as a survival mechanism baked into how this particular Park Service district handled things nobody wanted to examine too closely. He drove out to Pete Yan's store 2 days later, on his morning off, and found the old man exactly where he always was, restocking shelves behind the counter with the patient thoroughness of someone who'd been doing the same job for decades. "I followed your lantern," Jake said, without much preamble. Pete didn't look surprised. He set down the can he'd been holding and studied Jake for a long moment. "And here you are, in one piece, more or less. That's more than a lot of folks can say. What did you learn that wants people to think it's someone they know, someone they follow without question?" Pete nodded slowly, something grim and knowing settling into his expression. "That's about the size of it. My granddad used to say it doesn't actually want to hurt anybody. Not directly, not the way a bear or a bad fall would hurt you. It just wants company bad enough that it'll wear whatever face gets somebody to stay. Jake thought about the voice layered with Emma's own tone, patient and gentle and utterly wrong underneath. What happens to the people who do stay? Pete was quiet for a while before answering, wiping his hands slowly on a rag that didn't need it. Nobody rightly knows. That's the part that scares folks worst of all, I think. Not knowing is worse than any answer could be. Jake didn't go back into Devil's Hollow off duty again after that conversation, and he found himself, over the following months, developing the same careful habits he'd noticed in older rangers his first year on the job. The quiet insistence on pairs for night searches, the reluctance to fully explain certain closures, the private notebook he started keeping of small, unofficial details that never quite made it into any report. He noticed other things too, small shifts in the way the district operated that he suspected had been happening quietly for years before he ever arrived. A veteran ranger named Carol who always found a reason to avoid the northeastern loop entirely, even on slow administrative days when covering it would have been easy. A standing, informal rule among the local search and rescue volunteers that fog-related call-outs after dark always went out in teams of 3, never 2, a policy nobody had ever written down officially, but that everyone somehow understood and followed without question. Emma Ruiz sent him a card a few weeks later, thanking him formally for the rescue, mentioning briefly that she still had trouble sleeping some nights, still occasionally thought she heard her sister's voice calling from somewhere just outside her bedroom window, when she knew perfectly well her sister was 3 states away and sound asleep. Jake read the card twice before filing it away in the same drawer where he kept his private notes, understanding completely, without needing her to say it directly, exactly what she meant. She called him once more, almost a year later, her voice careful and measured in a way that told him she'd rehearsed what she wanted to say before dialing. I still think about it sometimes, she admitted. Not the fear, exactly, that's mostly faded. It's more that I remember, for just a second out there before you found me, actually wanting to keep following it. Like some part of me understood I probably shouldn't and didn't care anyway. I've never told anyone else that part. I don't know why I'm telling you now, except that you're the only person who'd actually believe me. Jake had sat with the phone pressed to his ear for a long moment before answering, thinking about his own brief hesitation in the trees, that same fraction of a second where following the light had felt, absurdly, like the more natural choice than turning away from it. I believe you completely, he told her. And for what it's worth, that feeling isn't something wrong with you. I think that's just what it does to people. That's the whole danger of it. The trail markers went up through Devil's Hollow within the month. Bright reflective blazes spaced closely enough that visibility concerns, officially at least, were considered resolved. Visitor complaints about fog-related disorientation dropped noticeably in the reports that followed. But Jake still hears from other rangers occasionally about strange lights spotted at a distance during night patrols, always described the same way, warm and amber and patient, moving steadily through the trees like someone who knows exactly where they're going and is simply waiting for the right person to decide to follow. He still stops by Pete Yan's store most weeks, picking up coffee and whatever small piece of local history the old man feels like sharing that particular afternoon, and neither of them has ever needed to say out loud that these visits have become, in their own quiet way, a kind of ongoing vigilance. 2 people keeping watch over a danger the rest of the world has mostly agreed to forget. A year and a half after the night he pulled Emma Ruiz out of the fog, Jake Sutton had settled into a version of himself he wasn't entirely comfortable admitting to. He still did his job well, still greeted visitors with the same easy competence that had made him popular with the tourists who passed through Devil's Hollow each season. But underneath that surface sat a watchfulness that hadn't existed in him before that first encounter, a low hum of readiness that never fully switched off. even on the quietest afternoons. He kept his private notebook in the same desk drawer, filled now with over a year's worth of small, carefully dated entries. Reports of lights spotted at a distance by other rangers during routine patrols. A hunting guide who mentioned, almost in passing, that his dog refused to walk past a certain bend in the northeastern loop no matter how much treats or coaxing he offered. A maintenance worker who'd found trail markers mysteriously relocated overnight, moved just far enough to redirect an unsuspecting hiker off the intended path and toward denser, unmarked forest. He'd started cross-referencing dates with weather logs somewhere around the 6-month mark, a habit that had begun almost accidentally during a slow winter shift and had since become something close to obsession. The pattern that emerged unsettled him more than he wanted to admit, even to himself. Nearly every unexplained incident in his notebook coincided with heavy fog conditions, and the frequency of those incidents seemed to be climbing gradually, month over month, in a way that felt too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. He'd mentioned this observation to exactly one person, a retired ranger named Harold he'd tracked down through old district records, and the old man had simply told him, over a brief and uncomfortable phone call, that some things were better left uncounted, because counting them made a man start expecting the next one. None of it amounted to proof anyone official would take seriously. All of it amounted, in Jake's private accounting, to a pattern he'd stopped trying to explain away. The call that changed things again came in during the last week of September. Unseasonably foggy, weather rolling through the district 3 days running. The kind of low, thick mist that turned familiar trails into uncertain gray corridors, even in broad daylight. A family of 4 had reported their teenage son missing after a day hike that had started, like Emma's, as an ordinary loop trail excursion. The boy's name was Marcus Webb, 15 years old, hiking with his parents and younger sister when he'd wandered ahead on a straight, well-marked section of trail and simply never reappeared at the point where the path curved back into view. His parents had waited nearly 45 minutes, calling his name with increasing panic, before finally hiking out themselves to get cell signal and call for help. Jake felt the familiar cold drop into his stomach the moment dispatch mentioned the location. Same district, same kind of foggy conditions. A missing teenager on a trail that should have made losing sight of someone for more than a few minutes almost impossible under normal circumstances. He called Pete in on his way to the trailhead, more out of habit than any real expectation the old man could offer anything beyond what Jake already carried in his own careful notes. Pete answered on the 3rd ring, his voice raspy with sleep despite the relatively early evening hour. "Sutton, something tells me this isn't a social call. Missing kid, out near the same section as Emma Ruiz. Heavy fog. I just wanted you to know, in case anything happens tonight and I don't get a chance to call again." There was a long pause on the line before Pete spoke again, his voice carrying a weight Jake hadn't heard from him before, something closer to genuine fear than the practiced, storyteller's gravity he usually brought to talk of the lantern. "Listen to me carefully, Jake. My granddad used to say the light gets bolder in certain years, comes out more often, takes more chances reaching further from its usual ground. We've had 3 strange disappearances reported to this store alone over the past 18 months that never made it into any official file. I think whatever's out there might be getting hungrier or bolder or both. You be careful tonight. More careful than you've ever been." "What do you mean bolder?" Jake pressed, pulling his truck over onto the shoulder of the access road so he could give the conversation his full attention. "It's never come this close to the main loop before. Not since Emma." Pete's breathing sounded heavier over the line, the sound of an old man choosing his next words with real caution. "My granddad kept a journal back when he still ran this store himself. I never told you that part. There's a section in it about a stretch of years back in the 30s when disappearances around the hollow came close together, 3 or 4 in a single season instead of one every few years like usual. He wrote that the old-timers back then believed something about drought conditions made it worse, though he never could say exactly why. We've had 2 dry summers running now. I've been meaning to mention that to you for weeks, and kept telling myself it was nothing. Jake felt something cold settle deeper into his stomach at that. The pieces of a pattern he'd already half suspected clicking into place with unwelcome clarity. Why are you telling me this now instead of weeks ago? Because I didn't want to believe it myself, Pete admitted quietly, and because some part of me hoped if I didn't say it out loud, it might just stay a coincidence a little longer. Jake absorbed that warning in silence for a moment before thanking Pete and ending the call, the old man's uncharacteristic fear settling into his chest alongside his own rising dread as he pulled into the trailhead parking lot. This time, he brought backup from the start. A ranger named Diego Flores, newer to the district than Jake, but sharp and steady in a way that made him easy to trust on short notice. Met him at the trailhead with a grim, focused expression that suggested dispatch had briefed him on at least some version of the district's unusual history. They call this section the Bad Loop sometimes. Back at the station, Diego said, as they geared up, checking his radio twice before clipping it to his belt. Nobody ever explains exactly why. You know something about that? Jake considered how much to say, weighing the risk of sounding unstable against the greater risk of sending a partner into these woods unprepared. I know enough to tell you this. If we see or hear anything that seems off, anything that doesn't feel quite right, even if you can't say why, you tell me immediately, and we stick together no matter what. No splitting up tonight. Understood? Diego studied him for a moment, something in Jake's tone apparently convincing him this wasn't ordinary caution talking. Understood. They started up the trail together, flashlights cutting narrow beams through fog that seemed, once again, unnaturally thick for the mild evening temperature, swirling in slow patterns that occasionally parted just enough to reveal glimpses of trail before closing back in. The Webb family waited anxiously at the trailhead with a third ranger, and Jake had made sure, before heading out, to instruct everyone remaining behind that no one else was to enter the trail after them under any circumstances, regardless of what they might hear. 20 minutes in, they found the first hiking pole, exactly the kind of deliberate placement Jake remembered from Emma's disappearance, planted upright in soft ground beside the trail, as though set there with careful intention rather than dropped in panic. Diego crouched to examine it, frowning. This doesn't look like an accident. Somebody put this here on purpose. I know, Jake said quietly. Stay close. They found a second marker not far past the first. This one stranger still, a child's shoe far too small to belong to Marcus, half buried in the soft earth beside the trail, as though it had been resting there for years rather than hours. Jake photographed it without comment, adding it silently to the mental catalog of details his official report would never include, and did not mention to Diego the particular chill that ran through him at the thought of how many other names, how many other families this stretch of forest might have quietly claimed over the decades without ever making it into any file at all. They continued forward, calling Marcus's name at steady intervals, and it was nearly 40 minutes later, deep enough into the fog that Jake had lost any confident sense of their actual position relative to the marked trail, when they saw the light. It hung low among distant trees, exactly the way Jake remembered, warm amber, swaying gently with a rhythm that suggested purposeful movement rather than any natural phenomenon. Diego's sharp intake of breath beside him confirmed he saw it too, which meant, at the very least, Jake wasn't losing his mind alone this time. That's not a flashlight, Diego murmured, voice tight. That's not any light source I've ever seen out here. Stay with me, Jake said firmly, and they moved together, following at a careful distance, refusing to let the light draw them into anything faster than a deliberate, controlled pace. The voice came a few minutes later, calling from somewhere off to their right. thin and frightened in exactly the register a genuinely lost 15-year-old boy's voice might carry. "Mom? Dad? I don't know where I am. Please, somebody help me. I'm really scared." Diego started forward instinctively before Jake's firm grip on his arm stopped him. "That's him. We need to go. That's clearly him." "Wait," Jake said, keeping his own voice low and steady. "Marcus, if that's really you, tell us your sister's name and how old she is." Another pause, longer than felt natural, before the voice answered, its rhythm subtly shifting into something too composed, too evenly paced for a genuinely panicked teenager. "I don't remember. I can't think straight. Please just come find me. I'm so cold and it's so dark out here." Diego's face had gone pale in the dim glow of their flashlights, understanding dawning slowly and unpleasantly. "That's not him. That doesn't sound right at all now that I'm actually listening for it." The temperature dropped sharply around them, the sudden cold arriving in a way that felt less like weather and more like a warning, sharp enough that both men's breath began fogging visibly within seconds. Diego swore quietly under his breath, backing a half-step closer to Jake without seeming to fully realize he'd done it. The light ahead of them brightened suddenly, began moving directly toward their position with that same deliberate, unhurried pace Jake remembered from his encounter with Emma. And beneath it, gradually resolving out of the fog, a shape began taking form, tall and thin, edges blurred, and shifting in a way that made Jake's stomach turn even though he'd braced himself, he thought, for exactly this. "We move now," Jake said, pulling Diego sideways through denser brush rather than continuing along their original path. "Whatever direction it wants us to go, we go the opposite way." They pushed through undergrowth that seemed to catch and pull at their clothing with deliberate persistence, and the light matched their new direction almost instantly, sliding through the fog to intercept them with an ease that defied the actual distance it should have needed to cover. It spoke then, the voice layering strangely, carrying fragments of Marcus's borrowed tone mixed with something colder and older underneath, the same unsettling quality Jake remembered from his encounter with Emma's stolen voice. "Stay, just a little longer. I have so much to show you both." Diego made a small, strangled sound beside him, some instinctive human horror finally breaking through professional composure. "What is that thing?" Jake didn't have a complete answer, and this wasn't the moment to attempt one. "Keep moving. Don't look directly at it if you can help it. Trust me." They ran together through fog that seemed determined to swallow every landmark, every reassuring sign of a marked trail, until Jake finally spotted, through a brief clearing in the mist, the pale glint of an official trail blaze nailed to a distant tree. He steered them both toward it with the last of his strength, Diego stumbling, but keeping pace beside him, the light pursuing at that same maddening, patient distance the entire way. They broke onto genuinely marked trail at almost the exact moment the fog began, mercifully to thin, and the light hesitated at the boundary the way it had before, pulsing once before drawing back into the deeper trees rather than following them onto ground that seemed, for reasons Jake still didn't fully understand, to offer some measure of protection. They found Marcus Webb barely 5 minutes further along the marked trail, sitting against a boulder in a small pull-off area well within the loop's normal boundaries, conscious and shivering, but otherwise unharmed, blinking up at them with the dazed confusion of someone who genuinely couldn't account for how much time had passed. "I don't understand," he said, voice cracking. "I was right behind my family. I just stepped off the trail for 2 seconds to look at something, and then everything got foggy and I couldn't find my way back. How long was I out here?" "Nearly 2 hours," Jake told him gently, helping him to his feet. "You're safe now. Let's get you back to your parents." Diego crouched briefly to check the boy's pulse and pupils, running through the same practical checklist Jake had taught him weeks earlier for exactly this kind of recovery, confirming no obvious signs of injury, beyond mild cold exposure. As they helped Marcus stand, Jake noticed the boy glance back over his shoulder toward the fog they'd just emerged from, his expression flickering briefly with something that looked almost like reluctance before settling back into ordinary relief. "I kept hearing my mom calling for me," Marcus said quietly, mostly to himself, as they started to walk back toward the trailhead. "But every time I got close to the sound, it just kept moving further away. It felt like it wanted me to keep walking. I don't know why I kept following it instead of just staying still and waiting." Jake exchanged a brief, knowing look with Diego over the boy's head, neither of them offering an explanation Marcus wasn't ready to hear, both privately recognizing the exact same pull that had nearly drawn each of them into following that light directly instead of staying on their guarded, careful path. The reunion at the trailhead was loud and tearful in exactly the way Emma's had been. Relief overwhelming every other emotion for the family gathered there. And Jake allowed himself a brief, exhausted moment of genuine gratitude before the weight of everything else settled back on his shoulders. Diego said little on the drive back to the station, processing in the particular silence of someone whose entire understanding of the natural world had just been quietly, permanently rearranged. Finally, pulling into the station parking lot, he turned to Jake with a question that carried real weight behind it. Is this going to keep happening every year, every season, just waiting for the next kid who wanders off trail for 30 seconds? Jake thought about Pete Yan's warning on the phone, the old man's uncharacteristic fear, the growing collection of small, dismissible entries filling his private notebook. "I don't know," he admitted honestly. "I think it might be. I think the best any of us can do is stay ready for it and make sure the next person who has to walk into that fog knows enough to come back out." He filed his official report the next morning, listing Marcus Webb as safely recovered after brief disorientation during unusually dense fog conditions, and made the same careful recommendations he'd made after Emma's rescue: additional signage, stronger barriers, increased ranger presence during high fog advisory periods. His supervisor approved everything without much comment. The same practiced in curiosity Jake had come to expect from an institution that seemed to understand, on some unspoken level, exactly how much easier it was to manage a hazard warning than an unexplainable truth. Diego requested a formal meeting with Jake 2 weeks later, off the clock, at a diner well outside the park boundaries where neither of them had to worry about being overheard by anyone who might report the conversation as concerned. He'd done his own research in the intervening days, he explained, digging through old newspaper archives and local historical society records, finding scattered references going back over a century to unexplained disappearances and strange lights reported in that same general section forest. "It's not just our district's problem, is it?" Diego said, sliding a folder of printed articles across the table. "This kind of thing shows up in other parks too. Different names, different local stories, but the same basic pattern. Lights that lead people astray. Voices that borrow the sound of someone you trust." Jake looked through the articles slowly, recognizing in them an unsettling echo of everything he'd personally witnessed. Confirmation that whatever lived in Devil's Hollow wasn't unique to this one stretch of forest, but rather part of something older and more widespread than either of them had previously understood. One clipping, yellowed and brittle, described a nearly identical account from a different state entirely. A hunting party in the 1890s who'd followed a swaying lantern light deep into unfamiliar woods only to have 2 of their 4 members never return. Their remaining boots found neatly arranged at the edge of a clearing nobody in the search party could ever locate again afterward. That detail hit Jake harder than he expected. The echo of Pete's story about his granddad's cousin landing with fresh, unwelcome weight. It's like it doesn't matter what forest, what decade. Same pattern every time. Diego nodded slowly, tapping the folder. "I found 6 separate incidents just from searching a few hours online. going back over 130 years. And that's only counting the ones that actually made it into a newspaper somewhere. I have to imagine plenty more never got written down at all, especially the older ones, especially anything involving native communities whose accounts the papers back then wouldn't have bothered printing in the first place. I think we just have to keep doing what we're doing, Jake said finally, closing the folder. Stay careful. Stay together out there. Keep the people who don't know safe without needing them to understand why. Diego nodded slowly, and neither of them said much else for the rest of that meal, both privately absorbing the particular weight of carrying knowledge neither of them had ever wanted, knowledge that would now, whether they liked it or not, shape every future night they spent walking those trails. Marcus Webb's family left the park the following week, cutting their remaining vacation short despite the boys' physical recovery being complete within days. Jake heard secondhand, through a colleague who'd spoken briefly with Marcus's mother at checkout, that the boy had started asking strange questions in the days after his rescue, wanting to know whether it was possible to hear someone's voice clearly even when they weren't actually speaking, wanting to know if his family had heard anything unusual calling out for him that night while they searched. Jake never learned exactly how that conversation with his mother had ended, but he understood, reading between the careful, secondhand details, that some fragment of whatever Marcus had experienced out there in the fog had followed him home in a way that ordinary recovery couldn't fully undo. Diego, for his part, stayed on in the district far longer than most rangers his age typically did before requesting a transfer somewhere quieter. When Jake finally asked him about it, nearly a year after the Webb rescue, Diego just shrugged and said something that stuck with Jake for a long time afterward. Somebody who actually knows what's out there should probably stay. Otherwise, it's just you carrying this alone, and that doesn't seem fair to either of us. Jake found himself thinking, more often than he expected, about all the names that must have come before Emma and Marcus, stretching back through Pete's stories, through the newspaper clippings Diego had unearthed, through decades and possibly centuries of quiet disappearances that had simply been absorbed into local folklore and half-remembered warnings passed down at general stores and family dinner tables. He wondered whether anyone, anywhere, had ever actually managed to stop it, or whether every generation of rangers and old-timers before him had simply done what he was doing now, staying watchful, staying paired up after dark, hoping that vigilance alone might be enough to keep the count from climbing any higher than it already had. He started, eventually, keeping a second notebook alongside his first. This one filled not with sightings and reports, but with practical advice, the kind of hard-won knowledge he wished someone had handed him before that first night chasing Emma's disappearance through the fog. Never follow a light through unmarked terrain. Always ask an unverifiable question before trusting a familiar voice calling from the trees. Never split up, regardless of how urgent the moment feels. He kept the notebook ready in his desk, telling himself it was simply good practice. Though some quieter part of him understood, he was preparing it for whichever ranger eventually replaced him. Someone who would need exactly this kind of guidance the first time the fog rolled in thick and an amber light began swaying gently somewhere off in the ancient hemlocks. The light still appears occasionally, according to the reports that continue trickling into Jake's private notebook, spotted at a careful distance by rangers who know, now, exactly how to recognize it and precisely how not to follow. It remains patient, unhurried, content to wait through months of quiet before another opportunity presents itself. Another hiker wandering 30 seconds too far from the marked trail. Another family distracted just long enough of the fog to roll in and the amber glow to begin its slow, steady approach through the ancient hemlocks of Devil's Hollow. Ranger Nate Foster had worked Blackroot Ridge for almost 4 years before he understood why the older staff always logged their patrol times with unusual precision, down to the exact minute rather than the rounded quarter hour most districts used. Nobody had ever explained the practice to him directly. He'd simply absorbed it the way new rangers absorb most unspoken district habits, following along without asking too many questions, until the night he finally understood exactly why it mattered. The call came in a little before 10 in the evening. A family reporting their 12-year-old son missing after a short evening walk along the ridge's lower loop trail, a path so gentle and well-marked that losing a child on it should have been almost impossible. The boy's name was Owen Pratt, and his mother, a woman named Diane, had let him walk just 20 yards ahead toward a scenic overlook while she finished packing up their picnic site. When she caught up to the overlook moments later, he was gone. Nate pulled the file on his way to the trailhead, noting with a small frown that this made the third missing person report from that same loop trail in just over 2 years, all children between the ages of 10 and 13, all vanishing during brief, seemingly harmless separations from a parent or guardian. Diane met him at the trailhead in obvious distress, her husband pacing anxious circles nearby while their younger daughter sat wrapped in a blanket in the back of their car. Diane's account matched almost exactly what Nate had read in the file summary of the district's 2 previous cases: a brief separation, a short distance, an apparently impossible disappearance in broad open terrain with no cover for a child to hide, and even if he'd wanted to. He said something strange right before he walked off, Diane told Nate, her voice tight and shaking. He said he heard someone counting, like a game of hide and seek, except he said the voice sounded like it was counting really slowly, way slower than normal. I told him to stay close, and he just smiled and said he wanted to see who was counting. Nate felt something cold settle into his chest at that detail, an echo of language he vaguely remembered from the 2 older case files, something about a counting voice mentioned by at least one of the previous missing children before their own disappearance. He radioed for backup and started up the loop trail immediately, flashlights sweeping across open, gently sloping terrain that offered almost no obstruction to visibility even in the deepening dusk. The trail wound along the ridge's edge with clear sight lines in most directions, making it, on paper, one of the safer and more forgiving trails in the entire park. Tonight, walking alone, Nate found the openness unsettling rather than reassuring. Something about the wide, exposed terrain made him feel watched from every direction at once, rather than protected by clear visibility the way it should have. He found Owen's water bottle within the first 10 minutes, sitting upright and centered exactly in the middle of the trail, positioned with a precision that felt deliberate rather than dropped in a hurry. Nate crouched to examine it and noticed, scratched faintly into the dirt beside it, a series of small marks arranged in a neat row, 7 notches cut cleanly into the packed earth. He counted them twice, an uneasy recognition building slowly in his chest. 7 matched, disturbingly, the number of days since the district's last confirmed missing persons report, a coincidence Nate desperately wanted to believe was simply that. He kept moving along the trail, calling Owen's name at regular intervals, and the forest around him had gone unnervingly quiet. The same complete absence of birdsong and insect noise that Nate vaguely recalled other rangers mentioning about this district without ever quite explaining why they found it worth mentioning at all. 15 minutes later, he heard it, a voice distant and patient, counting steadily upward from somewhere off the trail, evenly paced in a way that felt deliberately, unnaturally slow, each number given equal, careful weight rather than the quick, tumbling rhythm an actual game of hide and seek usually carried. 8, 9, 10. Nate followed the sound cautiously, leaving the marked trail despite every part of his training telling him this was exactly the kind of decision that got searchers lost alongside the people they were trying to find. The counting continued steadily as he moved, never rushing, never slowing, maintaining a patient, unbroken cadence that made his skin crawl the longer he listened to it. 11, 12, 13. He found a second set of marks scratched into a fallen log roughly 10 minutes later, another row of careful notches, this one totaling 12, and Nate's stomach turned as he made the connection without wanting to. 12 matched the number of children who'd gone missing across this entire park district over the past several decades, based on a record search he'd done idly, out of curiosity, during a slow shift earlier that year. 14, 15, 16. The voice grew closer as Nate pushed deeper into unmarked forest, the terrain shifting subtly beneath his boots from open, grassy ridge line into denser, older growth that shouldn't have existed this close to the well-maintained loop trail, according to any map he'd studied. His radio crackled uselessly at his hip, producing nothing but thick static laced faintly with something that might have been the same patient counting voice bleeding through the interference. 17, 18, 19. Nate stopped walking abruptly when the counting reached 20, some instinct warning him that whatever happened at the completion of this count mattered considerably more than anything that had happened during the counting itself. He crouched low near a wide, ancient oak, killing his flashlight and letting his eyes adjust to the thin moonlight filtering weakly through the canopy above. 20. Ready or not, here I come. The silence that followed felt different from the quiet that had accompanied him throughout the earlier part of his search. Heavier somehow, charged with an attention that made the hair on his arms stand up despite the mild evening temperature. Nate remained perfectly still, controlling his breathing, listening for any sound that might indicate which direction the voice's owner had begun moving. He heard footsteps eventually, slow and deliberate, moving through the underbrush with a measured pace that matched the strange, patient rhythm of the counting itself. Nate risked a careful glance around the oak's trunk and saw, perhaps 40 yards distant, a shape moving between the trees, tall and unnaturally thin, its silhouette catching just enough moonlight to suggest proportions that made his stomach clench with immediate, instinctive wrongness. It moved with the deliberate, searching quality of someone genuinely playing a childhood game, pausing occasionally to peer behind trees and beneath fallen logs with theatrical, exaggerated care, and Nate understood with sudden, sickening clarity that this performance of searching was not for a genuinely hidden child. It was for him, an invitation, a demonstration of the game's rules being extended toward whoever happened to be listening. He held perfectly still, watching the shape's slow, methodical search pattern gradually work its way closer to his position, and it was during that agonizing wait that he finally saw Owen. The boy stood motionless near the base of a smaller tree, roughly 20 yards from Nate's hiding spot, half hidden in shadow, watching the searching shape with an expression Nate couldn't quite read from this distance. Something between fear and fascination that made his chest ache with immediate protective urgency. Nate weighed his options in the span of a few racing heartbeats. Calling out risked drawing the searching shape's attention directly toward himself before he'd had any chance to assess what exactly he was dealing with. Staying silent risked losing track of Owen's position if the boy moved again before Nate could reach him. He chose to move instead, staying low, using the cover of scattered trees to close distance toward Owen without crossing directly into the shape's searching path. It took nearly 5 minutes of careful, silent movement to close the gap, each second stretching with unbearable tension as the shape's slow searching pattern continued somewhere behind him, occasionally pausing in ways that made Nate's pulse spike with the fear that he'd been spotted. He finally reached Owen's position and crouched beside him, keeping his voice to the barest whisper. "Owen, it's Ranger Foster. We need to move very quietly right now." The boy turned toward him slowly, and for one unsettling moment his expression held the same flat, patient quality Nate had glimpsed briefly in the searching shape's movements, before something shifted and real recognition broke through, his young face crumpling immediately into genuine, exhausted fear. "It's still looking for me," Owen whispered back, his voice shaking. "It said if it find me before I find a hiding spot, it wins. And I don't know what happens if it wins, but I don't want to find out." "We're leaving together, right now," Nate whispered firmly, taking the boy's hand and beginning to lead him carefully back through the trees, angling away from the searching shape's current position as quietly as their combined movement allowed. They made it perhaps 50 yards before the counting resumed behind them, faster this time, no longer patient, climbing rapidly upward with an urgency that hadn't been present before. 21, 22, 23, 24. Nate broke into a careful jog, pulling Owen along beside him, abandoning stealth now in favor of speed as the counting behind them climbed with alarming rapidity towards some threshold neither of them wanted to discover. 27, 28, 29, 30. The voice that followed the final number carried none of the earlier playful patience, dropping instead into something guttural and layered. Two distinct tones speaking in near unison, close enough now that Nate felt real, cold panic settle into his chest for the first time all night. "Found you." Nate pulled Owen into a sudden sharp turn, cutting through denser brush rather than continuing along their previous path, some instinct insisting that predictability was exactly what the thing behind them wanted. Branches tore at his jacket as he pushed forward, Owen stumbling, but keeping pace beside him, both of them moving now with the desperate, uncoordinated speed of pure survival instinct rather than any careful plan. Behind them, the sound of pursuit had changed entirely from the slow, deliberate footsteps of before into something faster and considerably less human, a rapid, uneven rhythm that covered ground with terrifying efficiency despite carrying none of the sound an ordinary running person would make. Nate spotted a break in the trees ahead, moonlight suggesting more open terrain beyond, and he pushed Owen toward it with the last reserves of his own flagging strength, both of them breaking free of the dense growth and stumbling onto what Nate recognized, with a flood of profound relief, as the actual marked loop trail. The pursuit behind them slowed abruptly the moment their boots hit packed, official trail surface, the rapid, uneven footsteps falling back into something more distant and hesitant, as though the boundary of maintained trail carried some significance Nate didn't fully understand but was deeply grateful for regardless. They ran the remaining distance back toward the trailhead anyway, unwilling to test how reliable that boundary actually was, and burst into the small gravel parking lot to find Diane and her husband still waiting anxiously beside their car. Backup ranger lights just beginning to appear on the access road behind them. The reunion was loud and tearful in exactly the way these moments always were, and Nate allowed himself only a brief, exhausted moment of relief before the reality of what he'd need to write in his official report settled heavily onto his shoulders. He filed the report the next morning, listing Owen Pratt as safely recovered after becoming disoriented while exploring off-trail terrain, citing dense forest cover and failing evening light as contributing factors. He made no mention of a patient counting voice, of careful notches scratched into logs and dirt, or of a searching shape whose pursuit had only relented once they crossed back onto official park boundaries. His supervisor approved the recommendation for additional signage along the lower loop trail without extensive discussion, and Nate found himself, in the days that followed, quietly pulling every historical file he could locate on missing children within this district, cross-referencing dates and circumstances with a growing, uncomfortable sense that the pattern he was uncovering stretched back considerably further than the 3 cases he'd initially been aware of. He found an old ranger named Bill Ashworth listed as the responding officer on a case from nearly 30 years earlier, tracked down his current contact information through district personnel records, and called him on his day off, uncertain exactly what he hoped to learn, but unable to shake the feeling that someone, somewhere in this district's history, must have understood more about Blackroot Ridge than official records ever documented. Bill answered cautiously, his voice carrying the particular wariness of someone who'd spent years expecting exactly this kind of call and dreading it anyway. Foster, I heard your name mentioned a few years back when you transferred in. Wonder how long it would take before you called me. Nate explained what had happened the previous night. Watching Owen and the searching shape, the counting, the notches scratched carefully into wood and earth. Bill listened without interrupting, and when Nate finished, there was a long pause before the older man finally spoke again. I worked that district for 22 years, Bill said quietly. Lost track of exactly how many kids went missing on that loop trail during that stretch, though I kept my own private count for a while, back when I still thought counting them might eventually add up to something useful. It never did. All I can tell you is what worked for me and the handful of others who figured it out early enough to matter. Never let a child walk more than an arm's length ahead on that trail, not even for a few seconds. And if you ever hear counting, don't wait for it to reach whatever number it's building toward. Move immediately and stay on marked ground no matter what. Nate absorbed that advice carefully, adding it silently to the growing collection of hard-won knowledge he suspected he'd be carrying, in one form or another, for the remainder of his career in this district. Do you have any idea what it actually is? He asked, though some part of him already suspected the answer wouldn't offer much comfort. Bill was quiet for a long moment before answering. I've heard theories over the years. Something that feeds on the particular fear of a child separated from safety. Something old enough that it learned the shape of childhood games because that fear used to come wrapped in exactly that kind of play. I don't know if any of that's true. I just know it's patient, and it's been doing this for a long time before either of us ever set foot on that ridge, and it'll probably keep doing it long after we're both gone. Nate thanked him and ended the call, sitting alone in his apartment for a long while afterward, turning Bill's words over carefully in his mind. He thought about Owen's small, shaking voice describing rules he didn't understand for a game he'd never agreed to play, about the notches scratched so carefully into wood and earth, marking some private tally that had clearly been building for decades before Owen ever wandered 20 yards ahead of his mother. In the months that followed, Nate developed the same careful vigilance he'd noticed in Bill's voice during that phone call. The quiet insistence on keeping young hikers close during patrols, the reluctance to fully explain certain closures to visitors who asked too many questions, the private notebook he began keeping alongside his official reports, filled with small, dismissible details that never quite made it into anything the Park Service would formally acknowledge. He started, eventually, personally walking every family with young children through the lower loop trail himself whenever his schedule allowed, offering casual, seemingly unremarkable safety reminders about staying close together, about avoiding wandering ahead even for brief moments, about immediately returning to the trailhead if anyone heard anything unusual during their visit. Most families thanked him politely and thought little more of it, assuming this was simply standard Park Service caution. Owen Pratt's family left the park within days of the incident, and Nate heard secondhand, through a brief conversation with Diane before they departed, that Owen had started sleeping with his bedroom door open and a nightlight on despite being well past the age most children needed such comforts. Unable to fully explain to his parents exactly why the dark now felt different to him than it had before that evening walk along Blackroot Ridge. The counting still gets reported occasionally, according to the entries steadily accumulating in Nate's private notebook, always described the same unsettling way by rangers and hikers alike. A patient, evenly paced voice rising steadily through numbers from somewhere just off whatever trail they happen to be walking, content to wait through however many quiet months or years it takes before the next child wanders far enough ahead, distracted just long enough for the ridge's ancient game to begin again. 2 years after the night he pulled Owen Pratt out of the trees along Blackroot Ridge, Nate Foster had become, without ever formally requesting the role, the district's unofficial authority on everything nobody wanted to put into an official report. Younger rangers came to him quietly, usually after their own first strange experience on the lower loop trail, and he found himself repeating Bill Ashworth's careful advice almost word for word each time. The same warnings about keeping children close, about never waiting for a counting voice to finish its count, about staying on marked ground no matter what. His private notebook had grown thick with entries by then, dozens of small, dismissible details that, taken together, painted a picture considerably darker than anything the Park Service's official records would ever acknowledge. He'd stopped trying to determine an exact pattern to when the entity grew active, though he'd noticed, the way Bill had once hinted at during their long-ago phone call, that certain years seemed to bring more incidents than others without any weather or seasonal explanation he could identify. This year had already brought 2 close calls before the incident that would change things again, both resolved quickly enough that neither made it past a quiet, unofficial conversation between Nate and the involved families. A boy who'd wandered off during a family reunion picnic, found within 20 minutes after his older cousin heard faint counting and immediately, wisely, refused to investigate alone. A girl who'd reported hearing someone playing hide and seek nearby while her parents packed up their car, though she'd stayed close enough to the trailhead that whatever had been counting never had the chance to draw her further. The third incident of the season arrived on a warm September afternoon, and this time the missing child was not simply lost for a brief, frightening stretch of hours. This time, an entire family group of 6 had entered the lower loop trail together, and only 5 had come back out. The missing boy was named Caleb Marsh, 11 years old, the youngest of 3 siblings on a family camping trip that included his parents, his 2 older sisters, and a family friend named Rita, who joined them for the weekend. According to the account Nate gathered at the trailhead that evening, the entire group had been walking together along the trail's midpoint when they'd stopped to let the children explore a small rock formation just off the main path, while within sight of the adults the entire time. Caleb's mother, a woman named Susan, described the moment it happened with the particular precision of someone who'd already replayed the memory countless times in the hours since. He was right there, climbing on the rocks with his sisters. I looked away for maybe 15 seconds to answer a text from my husband's brother, and when I looked back, both girls were still climbing, but Caleb wasn't with them anymore. I asked them where he'd gone, and they just looked confused, said he'd been right beside them the whole time. Nate felt the familiar cold weight settle into his chest at that account, an unwelcome and precise echo of Owen's disappearance 2 years earlier, except this time with an added detail that troubled him more than anything from the previous case. Both older sisters insisted, independently and without any apparent collusion between their stories, that Caleb had never actually left their immediate vicinity. One of them, a 14-year-old named Julia, kept repeating the same unsettling phrase whenever anyone asked her to explain further. "He's still right there," she told Nate, gesturing toward an empty patch of ground near the rock formation with obvious, growing distress. "I can still kind of see him, like out of the corner of my eye, but every time I actually look straight at that spot, there's nothing there." Nate crouched beside her, keeping his voice gentle despite the unease building steadily in his own chest. "Can you describe what you see out of the corner of your eye?" Julia hesitated, glancing nervously at her parents before answering. "It's Caleb, but it's like he's a little see-through, and he's not moving at all, just standing really still like he's playing a game. I called his name, and he didn't answer, and then when I actually turned to look right at him, there was nothing there except the rocks." Nate radioed for backup immediately, requesting the same careful protocol he'd established years earlier following his conversation with Bill Ashworth, insisting that under no circumstances should anyone attempt a solo search of this area, and that any searcher should remain in constant, direct communication with each other at all times. While waiting for the second team to arrive, He questioned the family further, gathering every small detail he could about the moments leading up to Caleb's disappearance. Rita, the family friend, mentioned almost in passing that she thought she'd heard something faint just before Susan looked up from her phone, though she'd assumed at the time it was simply distant birdsong or wind moving through the canopy. "It's probably nothing," Rita said, though her tone suggested she didn't fully believe her own reassurance. "It just sounded a little like someone counting way off in the distance." I didn't think anything of it until now. Nate absorbed that confirmation with grim, resigned certainty, understanding immediately that this case was going to require exactly the kind of careful, deliberate approach he'd spent the past 2 years quietly preparing for without ever expecting to need it applied to a search this immediate and urgent. His backup arrived within 20 minutes. A steady young ranger named Priya Chandra, who'd transferred into the district only 8 months earlier and had already heard enough secondhand warnings from her colleagues to approach the briefing with appropriate seriousness rather than the skepticism Nate himself might have carried in her position years ago. "I need you to trust everything I tell you tonight without questioning it, even if it sounds strange," Nate told her as they geared up together at the trailhead. "We stay together the entire time. We never split up regardless of what we hear or see. And if I tell you to move immediately, you move immediately without hesitating to ask why." Priya nodded seriously, checking her own equipment with steady, focused hands. "I've heard some things from the other rangers. I figured tonight might end up being one of those nights eventually." They started up the trail together, following the family's account to the exact spot where Caleb had last been seen climbing among the rocks. And Nate crouched there carefully, examining the ground with the same careful attention he'd learned to apply over years of similar searches. He found the first notch almost immediately, scratched cleanly into the flat surface of the largest rock. A single mark that felt, somehow, more deliberate and more recent than anything he'd documented in previous cases. Just one mark this time, Priya observed, crouching beside him. "Your notes mention the notches used to come in larger groups. I think this one's different," Nate said slowly, turning the observation over in his mind with growing unease. "I think this time it's not just taking him. I think it's showing us exactly where it took him from, like it wants us to understand something specific about how this happened." They continued their search outward from the rock formation in careful, expanding circles, calling Caleb's name at steady intervals. And it was nearly 30 minutes later, deep enough into the surrounding forest that the trail behind them had long since faded from view, that they both heard the counting begin. 1, 2, 3. The voice carried the same patient, unnaturally even pacing Nate remembered clearly from 2 years earlier. Each number given identical, deliberate weight, and beside him, Priya's breath caught sharply, her hand instinctively moving toward her radio despite already knowing, from Nate's earlier briefing, exactly how useless that instinct would prove. 4, 5, 6. "Stay close to me," Nate said quietly, and they moved together in the direction the sound seemed to originate from, deliberately slow and cautious rather than rushing headlong the way pure instinct demanded. 7, 8, 9. They found a second notch scratched into a fallen branch roughly 10 minutes later, and Nate's stomach tightened at the sight of it. A single mark again, reinforcing his growing, uneasy theory that this particular hunt carried some different significance than the broader, more general pattern he'd documented in his notebook over the previous 2 years. 10, 11, 12. The forest around them had gone completely silent apart from that steady, climbing count, the same total absence of birdsong and insect noise Nate remembered from his previous encounter. And he noticed Priya's flashlight beam trembling slightly as they pushed further into increasingly dense, unfamiliar terrain that shouldn't have existed this close to any section of maintained trail according to every map either of them had studied. 15, 16, 17. They spotted movement ahead through the trees roughly 10 minutes later, and Nate signaled Priya to stop and crouch low beside him, both of them going still as they watched a tall, unnaturally thin shape moving between distant trunks with the same theatrical, searching pattern Nate remembered vividly from his previous encounter, pausing occasionally to peer behind trees and beneath fallen logs with exaggerated, performative care. 20, 21, 22. That's it, Nate whispered, keeping his voice barely audible. That's exactly what I described to you earlier. We stay low, and we look for Caleb without engaging directly with that thing unless we have no other choice. They spotted the boy nearly 5 minutes later, standing motionless near the base of a large, twisted pine roughly 30 yards from their position, his posture holding the same unsettling, patient stillness Nate remembered from Owen 2 years earlier, an expression on his young face that seemed caught somewhere between fear and a strange, unnatural calm that troubled Nate more than open panic would have. 25, 26, 27. They began moving carefully toward Caleb, staying low and using available cover, and it was when they closed roughly half the distance that Nate noticed something that made his blood run cold with fresh, immediate dread. A second, fainter shape stood just behind Caleb, translucent and barely visible against the darker background of the forest, matching his posture almost exactly except slightly delayed, the same unsettling half-second lag Sam Cole Ridge had once described to Nate during a conversation about her own encounter at Raven Lake, an account he'd filed away in his notebook years earlier without fully understanding, until this exact moment, how directly it might connect to what he was witnessing now. Priya, he whispered urgently, there's something else there with him. Do you see it? She nodded slowly, her face pale in the dim moonlight filtering weakly through the canopy above. It looks like it's copying him, like a reflection, except there's no water anywhere near here. 30, 31, 32. Nate felt a growing, uneasy suspicion take shape in his mind, a theory he hadn't considered before this exact moment, but that now seemed disturbingly, inescapably plausible given everything he'd documented and heard secondhand from colleagues across the district over the years. Perhaps these encounters weren't entirely separate phenomena after all. Perhaps whatever haunted Blackroot Ridge and whatever lived beneath the still water at Raven Lake, and possibly whatever else lurked in other quiet corners of this same sprawling wilderness, were somehow connected, different faces and different rules governing the exact same ancient, patient hunger for company that refused to distinguish between the particular methods it used to lure someone close enough to keep. They closed the remaining distance quickly now, urgency overriding caution as the count continued climbing steadily behind them, and Nate reached Caleb first, crouching beside the boy and speaking in the same gentle, urgent whisper he'd once used with Owen 2 years earlier. Caleb, it's Ranger Foster. We need to move right now, very quietly. The boy turned toward him slowly, and for one deeply unsettling moment his eyes held that same flat, patient quality Nate remembered witnessing before something shifted and genuine recognition broke through, his young face crumpling immediately into exhausted, overwhelming relief. It told me if I stayed really still, my reflection would go find help instead of me having to walk anywhere, Caleb whispered, his voice shaking badly. But it's been so long, and nobody came, and I got scared that maybe it wasn't actually going to bring anyone back at all. Nate exchanged a brief, grim look with Priya over the boy's head, both of them absorbing the disturbing implication of what Caleb had just described, a variation on the entity's usual methods that neither of them had previously encountered or documented, something that suggested this particular presence was considerably more adaptable and considerably more dangerous than either of them had fully appreciated before tonight. We're leaving together, right now, Nate said firmly, taking Caleb's hand and beginning to lead him carefully away from the twisted pine, angling deliberately away from both the boy's unsettling translucent reflection and the direction where the searching shapes counting continued climbing steadily behind them. 40, 41, 42. They moved as quickly as careful stealth allowed, and it was perhaps 2 minutes into their retreat that the counting suddenly stopped entirely, an abrupt and unsettling silence falling across the forest that felt, if anything, considerably more dangerous than the steady climbing count that had preceded it. Nate felt every hair on his body rise at that sudden quiet, understanding immediately, from hard-won instinct built over years of documented encounters, that whatever came next would arrive without the courtesy of an audible countdown warning them of its approach. "Move," he said urgently, abandoning stealth entirely now in favor of speed, pulling Caleb into a full run while Priya matched their pace beside them, all three of them crashing through underbrush with a desperate, uncoordinated speed of pure survival instinct. Behind them, Nate heard the same rapid, uneven pursuit he remembered from 2 years earlier, footsteps that covered ground with terrifying efficiency despite carrying almost none of the sound an ordinary running person would make, closing distance with alarming speed as they fled through increasingly dense, unfamiliar terrain. Priya stumbled hard over an exposed root, and Nate grabbed her arm without slowing their overall pace, hauling her back upright as Caleb's small hand gripped his other hand tight enough to hurt. They broke free of the dense growth moments later, stumbling out onto what Nate recognized with overwhelming relief as the actual marked loop trail, and the pursuit behind them slowed abruptly the instant their boots hit packed, official trail surface, exactly as it had 2 years earlier with Owen. They didn't stop running until they reached the trailhead, bursting into the small gravel parking lot where Caleb's family waited in anguished, desperate hope, and the reunion that followed carried the same overwhelming mixture of relief and confused, exhausted tears that Nate remembered vividly from his previous encounter, though this time laced with an additional layer of unease as Julia, the older sister, watched her younger brothers return with an expression that suggested she hadn't fully processed what she'd witnessed earlier that evening. Nate filed his official report the next morning, listing Caleb Marsh as safely recovered after becoming separated from his family while exploring rock formations near the trail, citing failing evening light and dense surrounding terrain as contributing factors. He made no mention of translucent reflections, of counting that abruptly stopped mid-sequence, or of pursuit that had only relented once they crossed back onto official trail boundaries. He met with Priya 2 days later, off the clock, at the same quiet diner outside park boundaries where he himself had once compared notes with a colleague following his own first encounter years earlier. She'd spent the intervening time reading through as much of his private notebook as he'd been willing to share, and she arrived at their meeting with a folder of her own careful notes and questions. "Do you think it's the same thing every time?" she asked, sliding her folder across the table. "Or do you think there might be multiple things out here, each with slightly different rules, slightly different methods?" Nate considered the question carefully before answering, thinking about the translucent reflection he'd witnessed trailing Caleb, about Sam Coleridge's account of impossible mirrored shapes at Raven Lake, about Bill Ashworth's old theory regarding something ancient enough to have learned the shape of childhood fear across countless generations. "I used to think it was simple," he admitted finally. "One presence, one set of rules, contained to this one stretch of ridge. I don't think that's true anymore. I think whatever's out here, or whatever family of things is out here, has been adapting for a very long time, learning new methods, borrowing tricks from wherever they seem to work best." Priya absorbed that in troubled silence for a long moment before speaking again. "That's not exactly reassuring." "No," Nate agreed quietly. "It really isn't." They finished their meal mostly in silence after that, both privately turning over the weight of what tonight's encounter had revealed about the true scope of whatever haunted these woods. And Nate found himself, in the weeks that followed, expanding his careful vigilance even further than before, personally briefing every new ranger who transferred into the district regardless of their assigned section, insisting that Bill Ashworth's old warnings deserved to be passed down carefully and completely rather than left to fade into half-remembered rumor the way so much of this district's older history clearly already had. Caleb Marsh's family left the park within the week, and Nate heard, through a brief follow-up call with Susan some months later, that Caleb had developed a persistent, unshakable habit of avoiding stillness whenever possible, fidgeting constantly even during quiet moments, as though some part of him remained convinced that holding perfectly still for too long might once again summon something patient and hungry from wherever it had been waiting. Julia, meanwhile, had reportedly stopped mentioning the incident entirely, though Susan noted with quiet concern that her daughter now flinched visibly whenever anyone suggested a family hike, offering no explanation beyond a vague, uneasy insistence that she simply preferred staying closer to home these days. The counting still gets reported occasionally along Blackroot Ridge, according to the growing collection of careful entries filling Nate's private notebook, though he's noticed, in the years since Caleb's disappearance, an unsettling new pattern emerging alongside the familiar counting voice. Scattered reports from visitors describing brief, unsettling glimpses of their own reflection moving independently in still puddles or damp rock surfaces along the trail, always gone the instant anyone looks directly toward it, patient and watchful, content to wait through however many quiet seasons it takes before circumstances align again, and some distracted parent, some wandering child, drifts just far enough from safety to begin the old, familiar count once more. Ranger Dan Whitefield first heard the bell on a routine evening patrol along the Copper Creek Trail, a soft, distant chime that seemed to drift down from somewhere higher on the ridge despite there being no church, no farmhouse, no structure of any kind marked on any map for miles in that direction. He mentioned it to a colleague back at the station out of simple curiosity, and the older ranger's reaction, a sudden stillness followed by a carefully casual change of subject, told Dan more than any direct answer would have. He didn't think much more about it until the following spring, when a mining historian named Grace Holloway went missing while researching an abandoned copper mine said to sit somewhere in the ridge's upper reaches, a site so obscure it appeared on no official park records, known only through scattered references in old county documents and the memories of a few remaining longtime locals. Grace's research partner, a soft-spoken man named Felix Ortiz, reported her missing after she failed to return from what should have been a short afternoon hike to photograph the mine's entrance for a historical preservation grant application. He'd waited at their rented cabin for nearly 6 hours before finally driving to the ranger station, his composure fraying visibly as he explained the situation to Dan and his supervisor. She said she heard a bell, Felix explained, his hands trembling slightly around the coffee someone had given him. She thought it might mean there was still an active operation somewhere nearby, maybe a private claim, and she wanted to investigate before it got dark. I told her to wait for me, and she said she'd just be a few minutes. She just wanted to see where the sound was coming from. Dan felt an uncomfortable jolt of recognition at that detail, remembering his own encounter with the same phantom chime the previous autumn, a memory he'd mostly managed to file away as an unexplained curiosity rather than anything worth taking seriously. He pulled what limited records existed on the old copper mine before heading out, learning that the operation had closed abruptly in the early 1900s following what contemporary newspaper accounts described only vaguely as a series of accidents, the specific nature of which had never been fully documented in any surviving records Dan could locate on short notice. The mine had apparently used a large iron bell mounted near its main shaft entrance as a shift change signal, a detail that settled uneasily into the back of Dan's mind as he geared up for the search. He started up the ridge trail a little before 6 in the evening, following the general direction Felix indicated Grace had gone, calling her name at steady intervals into air that grew increasingly still and quiet the higher he climbed. His radio, reliable enough near the trailhead, began producing thin, intermittent static the further he pushed into the ridge's upper terrain, though it never cut out completely the way Dan had half expected based on stories he'd heard secondhand about other strange incidents across the district. He found Grace's camera bag within the first hour, sitting upright against a moss-covered boulder with its contents undisturbed, camera still inside, along with a small notebook filled with careful, methodical observations about the mine's likely location based on old survey maps she'd apparently sourced from a regional historical society. Dan flipped through the notebook carefully, documenting it with his own camera before continuing, and found her final entry unsettlingly abrupt compared to the careful, academic tone of everything preceding it. The bell is closer now. I can hear it clearly enough to tell it's not an echo or my imagination. Go and follow the sound for just a little further before turning back. Felix will worry if I'm not back soon, but I have to see this. There was no further entry after that. Dan closed the notebook slowly, tucking it into his own pack, and continued upward along a faint game trail that seemed to roughly track the direction Grace's notes suggested she'd intended to explore. The bell sounded again perhaps 20 minutes later, closer than Dan remembered it being during his previous encounter, a low, resonant chime that seemed to hang in the still evening air far longer than any ordinary bell should reasonably carry. He followed it cautiously, noting with growing unease that the terrain around him had begun shifting subtly from the mixed pine forest typical of this elevation into something older and stranger, scattered remnants of what might once have been mining structures poking through dense undergrowth that shouldn't have had time to grow so thick around abandoned equipment this recent in the district's history. He found a rusted iron rail section half buried in leaf litter, then a collapsed timber support strut. Then finally, emerging from the trees ahead, the unmistakable dark mouth of a mine shaft cut directly into the ridge's rocky face, its entrance partially obscured by decades of accumulated debris and creeping vegetation. The bell hung above the entrance exactly as historical accounts had described, a large iron shift bell mounted on a weathered wooden frame that, despite obvious age and exposure, showed none of the rust or structural decay Dan would have expected from over a century of abandonment. It hung perfectly still now, silent, though Dan felt an unmistakable, lingering vibration in the air around it, as though it had only just finished ringing moments before his arrival. "Grace," he called out toward the shaft entrance, his voice swallowed almost immediately by the surrounding silence. "Park Ranger, are you in there?" No response came from the darkness beyond the entrance, though Dan thought for just a moment that he heard something shift deep within the shaft, a soft scraping sound like boots against loose stone, moving away from the entrance rather than toward it. He clicked on his flashlight and approached the shaft carefully, noting the old support timbers framing its entrance, weathered but apparently still structurally sound despite their obvious age. A faint, cool draft flowed steadily from the darkness within, carrying with it a mineral, earthy scent that reminded Dan uncomfortably of standing water and old stone. "Grace," he called again, stepping cautiously across the threshold into the shaft's initial passage, flashlight beam sweeping across walls still marked with faint pickaxe scars from the mine's original excavation over a century earlier. The passage descended gently, curving gradually to the left, and Dan followed it with careful, measured steps, testing the ground ahead before committing his full weight with each stride. The bell chimed again behind him, back near the entrance, and Dan spun around instinctively. Flashlight beam catching nothing but the empty passage stretching back toward the fading evening light. That's not possible, he murmured to himself, certain nobody had passed him in either direction to reach the bell and set it ringing again. He continued forward regardless, driven by the knowledge that Grace remained somewhere ahead in this darkness, and it was perhaps 10 minutes deeper into the shaft that he found her, sitting motionless against the passage wall, her own flashlight discarded on the ground beside her, its beam still weakly illuminating a small circle of stone floor. "Grace," Dan said, relief flooding through him as he hurried to her side, checking quickly for obvious injury. "Are you hurt? Can you hear me?" She turned toward him slowly, and something about the deliberate, unhurried quality of that movement made Dan's relief curdle immediately into fresh unease. Her eyes, when they finally met his in the flashlight's beam, held a strange, distant quality, focused on him but somehow simultaneously fixed on something considerably further away. "I found them," she said, her voice carrying an odd, hollow resonance that echoed slightly against the passage walls despite the confined space offering little room for genuine echo. "The miners. They never actually left, Dan. They've just been waiting down here this whole time for someone to ring the bell and finally let them go home." Dan felt cold dread settle into his stomach at that statement, delivered with the calm, matter-of-fact certainty of someone describing an established fact rather than a delusion born of exhaustion or fear. "We need to get you out of here right now," he said firmly, helping her to her feet despite her surprising resistance. "I don't think I'm supposed to leave yet," Grace said, her voice still carrying that same unsettling hollow quality. "They told me if I stayed and listened long enough, they'd finally be able to explain what actually happened down here. I think I need to hear the rest of it before I go." Dan pulled her firmly toward the passage entrance regardless, ignoring her continued soft protests, and it was as they moved back toward the fading light ahead that he first heard the voices, faint and layered, drifting from somewhere deeper in the shaft behind them. Dozens of voices speaking simultaneously in low, indistinct murmurs that carried an unmistakable quality of collective, patient grief. Grace stiffened in his grip, turning her head back toward the sound despite Dan's insistent pull forward. "They're trying to tell me something. I need to go back and listen properly this time." "No," Dan said firmly, tightening his hold on her arm and increasing his pace toward the entrance despite her continued resistance. "We're leaving. Whatever's back there, it's not something either of us needs to understand tonight." The bell rang again as they approached the entrance, louder this time, and beneath its resonant chime, Dan thought he heard something that sounded disturbingly like a chorus of voices calling out in unison. A single word repeated with mournful, layered insistence that he couldn't quite parse clearly enough to be certain he'd actually heard it correctly. "Stay." They broke out into the fading evening light together, Grace stumbling slightly as the mine's cool, mineral-scented air gave way to the ordinary forest atmosphere outside, and Dan felt her resistance finally begin easing the further they moved from the shaft entrance, as though whatever influence had held her in its grip weakened progressively with each step of increasing distance. By the time they descended halfway back down the ridge trail, Grace seemed almost entirely herself again, her earlier hollow, distant quality replaced by genuine, exhausted confusion as she tried to piece together an account of what exactly had happened to her over the preceding hours. "I remember following the bell sound," she said slowly, working through the memory with visible difficulty. "And then finding the mine entrance, and then everything after that feels strange, like I was there, but not fully paying attention to my own thoughts, like something else was doing most of the thinking for me." Dan didn't press her further, focused instead on getting them both safely back to the trailhead before full darkness settled over the ridge, and it was only once they'd reached his truck and he'd radioed in confirmation of her safe recovery that he allowed himself to fully process what he'd witnessed and heard deep within that abandoned shaft. Felix's reunion with Grace carried the same overwhelming mixture of relief and confusion Dan had witnessed in countless similar reunions over his career, though he noticed Grace remained unusually quiet throughout the drive back to their cabin, staring out the window with an expression that suggested she was still working through memories that didn't entirely make sense even to herself. Dan filed his official report the next morning listing Grace Holloway as safely recovered after becoming disoriented while exploring the abandoned mine site, recommending the area be formally added to the district's hazard closure list due to unstable mine shaft conditions and risk of structural collapse. He made no mention of a bell that seemed to ring itself, of layered voices murmuring from somewhere deep in the mountain Stoneheart, or of the strange, hollow quality that had briefly overtaken Grace's own voice and manner while trapped within that darkness. His supervisor approved the closure recommendation without much discussion, adding it to an already substantial list of similarly worded hazard warnings scattered across various sections of the district that Dan had begun to suspect, based on quiet conversations with colleagues over recent months, covered considerably more unusual territory than their official language ever suggested. He drove out to visit a longtime local historian named Walter Briggs a few days later, hoping the old man's decades of research into the region's mining history might offer some insight into what he'd witnessed. Walter listened to Dan's careful, edited account without much visible surprise, nodding slowly at certain details as though confirming information he'd already suspected rather than learning something entirely new. There was an incident at that mine back in 1906, Walter explained, pulling a thick, worn folder from a nearby shelf. Cave entrapped a full-shift crew, 11 men, deep in the lower tunnels. Rescue efforts took almost 2 weeks, and by the time they finally broke through, there was nothing left to recover. The official record just says the mine was abandoned shortly after due to structural concerns. Local stories always told a different version, though one that never made it into any official document. What version? Dan asked, though some part of him already suspected he wouldn't like the answer. Walter's expression grew grim. Story goes the mine owner refused to properly seal the site afterward, worried about the cost, and instead just walked away, leaving the shift bell hanging right there at the entrance like it was still waiting for a crew that was never coming back up. Old-timers used to say you could still hear it ring sometimes, usually right before someone else went missing up there. I always figured that part was just superstition built up around a genuine tragedy. Sounds like maybe I was wrong to assume that. Dan absorbed that history in troubled silence, thinking about the layered voices he'd heard murmuring from deep within the shaft, about Grace's unsettling account of miners still waiting, still hoping for someone to finally let them go home. He didn't return to that section of Ridge off-duty again after his conversation with Walter, though his work still occasionally required patrols along the lower trail approaching that area. He started, in the months that followed, keeping a private notebook of his own, adding careful entries about other unusual reports scattered across the district that colleagues occasionally mentioned in passing, strange bells heard by hikers in areas with no historical mining activity on record, faint chanting or murmuring reported near several other abandoned sites throughout the park's broader boundaries, small details that, taken together, suggested Copper Creek's mine was far from the only. Forgotten tragedy still quietly, patiently making itself known to anyone who wandered close enough to hear it calling. Grace Holloway completed her historical research project eventually, publishing a careful, thoroughly documented account of the mine's operational history and the 1906 cave and that had ended it, though she told Dan during a brief follow-up call that she deliberately omitted several details from her own experience that she knew no academic publication would ever take seriously. She mentioned, almost as an aside, that she still sometimes heard faint bell chimes in Ordinary, unrelated settings, a distant church bell, or a wind chime catching a breeze, and that each time it happened her chest tightened with an entirely disproportionate flash of old, remembered dread. The closure signage went up around the old mine entrance within the month, warning visitors away from unstable terrain and structural hazards in language that, as always, told only the smallest, most defensible fraction of the actual truth. Reports of the bell continued trickling in occasionally over the following years, always described the same unsettling way by hikers and rangers alike, a distant, resonant chime carrying from somewhere higher on the ridge, despite no structure existing anywhere nearby, capable of producing such a sound, patient and mournful, content to wait through however many quiet seasons it takes before the next curious traveler wanders close enough to wonder exactly where that beautiful, haunting sound might be coming from, and decides against every reasonable instinct to go and see for themselves.